Welcome to Earthology, where time drifts like waves across forgotten shores. In this journey, we'll trace the rise and legacy of the Phoenicians, the first true sailors of civilization. From cedar-scented harbors to distant Atlantic winds, their story unfolds in whispers of trade, courage, and timeless connection across the sea. The sea is where memory begins. Before Greece, before Rome, before the age of marble and empire, there was only the rhythm of water touching land, an eternal pulse that shaped the first cities, the first voyages, the first dreams of connection. Along the eastern edge of the Mediterranean, where the mountains of Lebanon descend sharply into the sea, a civilization was born that would come to master this rhythm. They were the Phoenicians, though that was not what they called themselves. They had no single name, no single king, no single crown. They were a constellation of coastal cities: Byblus, Sidon, Tyre, Arwad, and Beirut. Each one was a world unto itself, yet bound to the others by wind, wood, and water. The land that bore them was narrow, a ribbon pressed between the mountains and the sea. To the east rose cedar-covered slopes, scented and solemn, their trunks destined for temples and ships. To the west the horizon opened, an endless blue plain more vast than any kingdom. In that narrow space between forest and tide, something remarkable took root. A people who found in the sea not fear, but freedom. Theirs was a landscape of necessity and possibility. The soil was thin and rocky. Harvests were uncertain, but harbors were plentiful. Rivers cut down from the mountains into small valleys, their mouths cradling natural inlets where the first boats could anchor. Here, humanity met the water and learned to move with it. The Phoenicians inherited the spirit of their Canaanite ancestors, the builders and traders of the Bronze Age, who had once supplied Egypt's pharaohs with the towering cedars that roofed their palaces and ships. Long before the Greek language existed, long before the word Phoenicia was ever spoken, the timber of Lebanon sailed south on the Nile's flood, a gift from one shore of the world to another. Through centuries of exchange, these early coastal cities learned the art of balance. Egypt's power waxed and waned. Empires rose and fell in Mesopotamia. But between them, the ports of Byblus and Sidon endured. They survived by listening to the winds, to the markets, to the silence of the horizon. Where empires sought conquest, these cities sought connection. The sea, to them, was not a boundary but a bridge. When the world of the Bronze Age collapsed around 1200 BCE, when cities burned from Greece to Anatolia, when the sea peoples swept across the coasts, and kingdoms crumbled into myth, these shores remained. Somehow, the storms that ended empires spared them. Perhaps it was because they were already children of the sea. They could bend without breaking, flee without vanishing, rebuild where others could not. And from those survivors came something new, a rebirth of seafaring, of craft, of daring. These were the people the Greeks would later name Phoenix, the red ones, perhaps for the glowing hue of their famous dye, or for the ruddy cliffs of their homeland at sunset. To themselves, they were simply the people of their cities. A sailor of Tyre, a merchant of Sidon, a craftsman of Byblus. No one among them would have claimed to be a Phoenician. Their unity was not in borders, but in understanding, the shared knowledge that the sea could be both cradle and road, a mirror of life itself. By the early first millennium BCE, their ships were already the finest on the Mediterranean. Built from cedar and oak, ribbed with curved keels, and bound by rope stronger than iron, they carried timber, glass, metals, and textiles across waters that most still feared to cross. They were the first to navigate confidently beyond the sight of land, guided by the stars and by memory. Each voyage began in silence. A ship pushed from the harbor, its sail catching the morning wind, its prow pointing west. Behind it, the mountains of home faded into blue haze. Before it stretched the endless water, the road to Cyprus, to Crete, to Egypt, to lands the Phoenicians would soon discover and settle. Trade was their language, and curiosity their compass. They sailed not as conquerors, but as messengers, bringing cedar and glass, purple cloth, and carved ivory to distant shores, and in return carrying back silver, tin, amber, and stories. In every port they touched, they left behind not soldiers but symbols, the marks of their script, the shapes of their letters, the quiet evidence of exchange. Out of necessity came ingenuity. The Phoenician coast had little farmland, few metals, and no empire to command tribute. But it had forests, craftsmanship, and a will to wander. To survive, they turned movement into mastery. They became the thread that stitched the edges of the Mediterranean together. Egypt to Greece, Anatolia to Spain, the Aegean to the Atlantic. Each harbor they entered became a reflection of home. Markets filled with scent and color, the murmur of languages blending, the clink of amphorae and the creak of ropes. Over centuries, this rhythm of travel created something larger than any kingdom, a vast, invisible network of exchange that carried not only goods but ideas. In time, the alphabet itself would travel with them. A gift born from the need to record, to remember, to trade across distance. 22 simple signs, written from right to left, elegant and efficient. It would pass from Phoenician merchants to Greek scribes, from Greeks to Romans, and from Rome to the languages we speak today. All of it, every word, every voyage, every connection, began here, on that thin strip of land where cedar met salt. The Phoenicians were not a people of conquest. They did not carve empires upon the land. Their kingdom was invisible, drawn on the shifting surface of the sea. Yet its influence was vast and enduring, because it was built not on power, but on connection. When we speak of them now, we speak in echoes, in the creak of a wooden hull, in the smell of resin and salt, in the quiet industry of a harbor at dawn. Theirs was a civilization without monuments, yet it shaped the course of the ancient world. They showed humanity something simple and profound, that the sea, though untamed, could be a friend, that across its vast expanse lay not isolation, but kinship. The mountains still stand above their ancient ports. The cedar forests are fewer now, their shadows thinner, but the wind that once filled their sails still moves across the same water. The coast of Lebanon still gleams at sunrise, and beneath those waves lie the remnants of the first true mariners, the forgotten masters of the sea. This is their beginning, the birth of a people who turned geography into destiny, who listened to the sea, until it spoke back who taught the world that movement is memory, and that every shore touched by trade becomes part of a larger story. This is the story of the Phoenicians, a civilization that made the sea its home, and in doing so, taught humanity to see the horizon not as an end, but as a beginning. The sea had always been there, vast, patient, indifferent, but for the people of the Levant, it became something more than a horizon. It became a calling. When other civilizations hesitated at the shore, these people stepped forward. They built not monuments of stone, but vessels of wood, not empires of armies, but empires of wind. This was the beginning of the age of sailors, the quiet revolution that would carry the Phoenicians across the known world. From their harbors, Tyre, Sidon, Byblus, the smell of cedar resin hung in the air. The forests of Lebanon, once thick and ancient, offered trees that reached as high as temples. To fell a cedar was a sacred act. Each trunk was measured, blessed, and prepared, its heartwood chosen for strength and endurance. On those timbers, the Phoenicians built their ships, curved, ribbed, living things that could endure the weight of water and wind. The Mediterranean was not a gentle teacher. Its moods shifted without warning. One day it was a sheet of blue glass, the next a landscape of chaos and foam. Yet the Phoenicians learned to read it as others read Scripture. They studied the shape of the clouds, the language of birds, the pull of currents between headlands. They learned to navigate by the stars, not only by the sun that ruled the day, but by a star that did not move, the one we now call Polaris. To them it was a fixed eye above the waves, a guide to those who had left the safety of land behind. Their ships were miracles of design. The earliest were small cargo vessels, broad in the hull and steady in the water, perfect for hugging coasts and carrying heavy loads. Later came the long ships, sleek, narrow, built for speed and maneuverability, driven by rows of oarsmen who moved as one. The Phoenicians invented the true keel, a spine of wood running beneath the ship, giving it balance and strength. They carved prows in the shapes of horses or birds, symbols of guidance and protection. Each voyage was a ritual. Before departure, sailors made offerings to the gods, to Baal of the heavens, to Melkart of Tyre, to Astarte, mistress of the sea. They poured oil upon the waves and whispered prayers into the wind. Then, when the tide turned and the breeze filled the sail, the ship would glide away, and the land would fall silent behind them. In those early centuries, every voyage was an act of faith. There were no maps as we know them, only stories. Directions were measured in days and remembered in song. 3 days to Cyprus, 10 to Crete, 20 to the farthest shore. The sea was a vast and living text, and each generation added its own verses. The Phoenicians were not explorers in the modern sense. They did not set out to conquer or to chart. They sailed to trade, to survive, to weave the scattered coasts of the Mediterranean into a single tapestry of exchange. Yet in doing so, they became the first to truly understand the shape of the world. By the 9th century BCE, their routes stretched from the Aegean to North Africa, from the coasts of Anatolia to the Pillars of Hercules, the straits we now call Gibraltar. Along these routes they founded ports and stations, small harbors where ships could rest, repair, and replenish. Some were temporary, little more than clusters of huts and warehouses. Others grew into cities that would outlast empires. Each port mirrored the homeland, a piece of Tyre, a whisper of Sidon transplanted to distant shores. There were markets filled with the smell of olive oil and tar, workshops where glassmakers shaped molten sand into shimmering vessels, and shrines where the same gods of the East watched over foreign waters. The Phoenicians carried not just goods, but their world, language, faith, and art wherever their ships went. Their cargoes were the veins of civilization. From the cedar forests came timber for ships and palaces. From the mountains came copper and iron, from the coast glass and dyes. From the hinterlands of other lands came gold, tin, silver, and precious stones. In return, they brought pottery, textiles, and ideas. Trade was not only the exchange of objects, but of imagination. In every deal struck across the deck of a Phoenician ship, something unseen was also traded. A word, a custom, a glimpse of how other people lived. Even in an age before written contracts, trust was their greatest currency. A Phoenician merchant might sail thousands of kilometers across dangerous seas to reach a port he had never seen, and yet be greeted not as a stranger, but as a partner. It was said that their ships carried peace with them. They were merchants of connection, not conflict. In this, they were unique. Other civilizations built greatness through conquest. Egypt had its armies, Assyria its walls of iron, Greece its phalanxes. The Phoenicians had only their ships and their wits. But in the end, it was trade, not war, that bound the ancient world together. The Mediterranean, once divided by fear and distance, became a single breathing organism. The ports of North Africa learned the craft of Phoenician shipwrights. The islands of the Aegean learned to write their own languages in Phoenician script. The sea itself became a highway of thought. The rhythm of their lives followed the tides. A sailor might spend months away, following the routes westward, carrying cedar beams or jars of oil. When he returned, he would bring home stories, of strange islands where the mountains smoked, of lands where the sun set later and the stars moved differently. Children would listen in awe as he spoke of places beyond the known world. In these tales, the Mediterranean expanded, not as a map, but as a memory shared by all who touched its waters. The Phoenicians knew the danger of this life. They spoke of it not with fear, but with reverence. The sea gave, and the sea took away. Storms could rise without warning. A single crack of lightning could shatter a mast. Yet for them, to die at sea was not tragedy, but fulfillment. To live by the sea was to live between certainty and wonder, between the known and the infinite. Their gods reflected this duality. Melkart, the protector of Tyre, was both creator and destroyer, lord of storms and patron of merchants. Astarte, whose temples lined the coasts, ruled love and fertility, but also the deep, unseen currents. To sail was to move through the realm of the divine, and every voyage was a prayer written in motion. It is said that the Phoenicians were the first to hear the sea as language. They learned that the creak of the hull and the slap of waves were not noise but dialogue. In the shifting of the wind, they heard instruction. In the scent of salt, they felt direction. The ocean became their text, and they became its translators. By the 8th century BCE, their influence had spread so far that the Greeks called them the merchants of the world. Yet to the Phoenicians themselves, this was not empire. It was survival made beautiful. Theirs was an empire without walls, invisible but enduring, traced in the wake of ships and the memory of markets. Every plank of wood, every knot of rope, every jar of dye carried across the sea was part of a greater purpose, to keep the world connected, to keep movement alive. In their wake followed the birth of civilization as we know it. Writing, trade, craftsmanship, and the idea that across distance we can still be one people. When we look at the map of the Mediterranean today, we see coastlines shaped by millennia of tides. But beneath those waves still lie their harbors, the stone anchors, the fragments of amphibia, the ghosts of ships that once carried the dreams of a world learning to speak across the sea. The age of sailors was not only the age of travel. It was the age of trust. The moment humanity learned that the horizon is not an ending, but an invitation. There are empires you can see, carved into the earth, their borders marked by walls and fortresses. And there are empires you cannot, empires that move, breathe, and vanish with the tide. The Phoenicians built the latter. They ruled not by sword or decree, but by distance and return, by the pulse of trade that connected distant shores. Their empire was drawn not on maps, but upon the water. From the harbors of Tyre and Sidon, fleets of ships fanned out across the Mediterranean, their sails like white wings against the blue. They did not march outward. They drifted, docked, and exchanged. Every port they entered became part of an invisible constellation, a network of trust stretching from the Levant to Spain, from Cyprus to the coasts of Africa. This was an empire without capital or emperor, bound together by movement. Its wealth lay in what flowed between places: timber for gold, glass for grain, purple cloth for silver. And in that flow, something deeper traveled: language, faith, and art. The Phoenicians had learned early that permanence was not the secret of survival. The storms of empire had already swept across their world: Egypt, the Hittites, the Sea Peoples. All had come and gone, but trade endured. So they built their world not on conquest, but on conversation. Every voyage, every transaction, every shared meal upon a dock was a thread woven into the fabric of the ancient world. When their ships appeared on a horizon, people did not ready their defenses. They prepared their markets. In Cyprus, they exchanged wood and pottery for copper, the lifeblood of the Bronze Age. On Crete, they traded fine cloth for olive oil and wine. In Egypt, they offered timber and glass in return for papyrus, ivory, and gold. Along the Aegean, They brought dyes and metals to the fledgling Greek cities, whose poets would one day sing of them as mysterious Eastern sailors. To the west, their voyages reached Sicily, Sardinia, and the coasts of North Africa. In time, they would pass beyond even that, through the narrow straits the Greeks called the Pillars of Heracles, the gates of the known world to the Atlantic beyond. There, at the edge of myth, they found new lands rich in silver and tin. The map of their influence was not one of conquest, but of light, small beacons scattered across the sea. Each port was a reflection of the homeland, a dock, a warehouse, a shrine. Always a shrine. The same gods watched over them in every harbor. Melkart of Tyre, Baal of the heavens, and Astarte, queen of the stars and sea. These deities traveled with their people like companions, not rulers, their temples built of stone and silence beside markets alive with sound. Archaeologists today uncover the remnants of those colonies. Fragments of pottery, inscriptions carved in the Phoenician script, the faint outline of harbors long filled by silt. In Spain, near modern Cadiz, lies one of their oldest outposts. The city the Phoenicians called Gader still bears the echo of its name. From there, their ships sailed north to trade with the peoples of Iberia and the Celts who mined tin in the misty lands beyond. In each encounter, they brought not just commerce, but contact. They carried technology, the potter's wheel, the art of glassmaking, the use of iron tools. They carried stories of gods, of storms, of distant lands. And they carried letters, the symbols of their language, small enough to fit in the palm of a hand, yet powerful enough to outlive every empire they met. Their empire without walls had another kind of strength. It could not be besieged. It could not be conquered in a single stroke. Even when their cities fell, the spirit of the Phoenicians remained on the water. As long as ships sailed, their world endured. Trade routes became memory routes. Each harbor was a chapter, each voyage a verse. And the Mediterranean, once a boundary between civilizations, became a single, shared world. Imagine the scene at one of their ports in the 8th century BCE. The air is thick with the smell of tar and salt. Ships line the harbor, their hulls heavy with goods. Sailors shout in a dozen tongues. Amphorae filled with oil and wine are rolled down wooden ramps. Traders from Egypt bargain beside Greeks, Libyans, and Etruscans. The sunlight glints off bronze, glass, and gold. Somewhere nearby, a priest pours a libation to Melkart, thanking him for safe arrival. And at the water's edge, a young boy watches a ship being loaded, dreaming of distant shores he has never seen. This was the empire at its height. An empire not of power, but of presence. The Phoenicians' genius lay not only in navigation or trade, but in adaptation. Wherever they went, they blended with the land and its people. In North Africa, their settlements mingled with local Berber tribes. On Cyprus and in Sicily, they lived alongside Greeks. In each place, they left traces of their culture, fragments of language, echoes of belief, while absorbing what they found in return. They were not strangers to assimilation. They were its architects. Through this exchange, they taught the Mediterranean the art of coexistence. They proved that influence need not destroy to endure. Theirs was not the voice that shouted. It was the voice that whispered and was remembered. Their craft spread as their trade grew. The art of glassmaking, perfected along their coasts, became one of their most prized exports. They melted sand and lime in furnaces, fueled by the cedar forests, shaping the glowing liquid into beads, jars, and delicate ornaments. To distant peoples, it must have seemed like magic, sunlight made solid. Their artisans also worked in ivory and metal, carving and casting with precision born of centuries. And always, their ships carried the deep purple cloth that would become their signature. Made from the murex shellfish found only along their shores, this dye was so rare that it came to symbolize wealth and divinity. Kings clothed themselves in it. Temples were draped in it. The very word Phoenician became linked to its hue. But that story, the story of the purple, belongs to another tide. The invisible empire of the Phoenicians was not free from peril. Pirates stalked their routes. Storms wrecked their ships upon unseen rocks. Sometimes rival powers sought to seize their ports. But the Phoenicians had learned a deeper resilience, to rebuild where they were broken, to return where they were refused. Their mastery was not domination, but endurance. Over centuries, their web of colonies became a living network. News of wars or floods in one corner of the sea could reach another within weeks. Prices of goods, the movements of fleets, even rumors of new lands passed along their routes like the whisper of a tide. In a world before printing or telegraph, they built the first communication system of civilization, a network carried by wind and oar. When the Greeks began to rise, they inherited this world, the ports, the routes, the alphabet, the very idea that the Mediterranean could be one great connected sea. The Phoenicians had drawn the outline. Others would later fill it in. Today, the stones of their harbors lie buried under silt and sand. Yet the pattern they traced endures in every trade route, every ship that crosses an ocean, every exchange between distant peoples. Theirs was an empire that could not fall because it was never built to stand still. The sea was their capital. The wind was their currency. Connection was their crown. And so, as the centuries passed, their invisible dominion spread farther still, toward islands and continents that would remember their touch long after their names had faded. Among the many treasures the Phoenicians carried across the sea, none shone more brightly than their color. It was a color drawn not from mineral or flower, but from the living sea itself, a purple so deep it seemed to hold the dusk within it. To the world, it became a symbol of kingship, wealth, and eternity. To the Phoenicians, it was a testament to patience, to craft, and to the strange alchemy between nature and human hands. This is the story of Tyre, the island city that rose from the waves to command a kingdom without land, and of the dye that made its name eternal. Tyre was the beating heart of Phoenicia. Situated a short distance offshore, ringed by powerful walls, it stood like a fortress adrift in the Mediterranean. 2 harbors opened to the north and south, filled with ships that came and went at all hours. Freighters laden with cedar beans, merchants arriving from Egypt or Cyprus, and smaller craft bound for the colonies of the Western Sea. Behind the harbor walls rose the temples of Melkart, the city's patron god, lord of renewal and the sea. His flame burned day and night, visible even from the distant mainland. To live in Tyre was to live surrounded by water. The sea washed its stones, mirrored its sky, and provided everything its people needed: food, trade, and the source of their wealth. That source was a creature few would notice, a small sea snail, the murex. It clung to rocks beneath the shallow waves, its shell hard and spined, its flesh pale. But inside, hidden deep within its body, was a tiny gland containing a milky fluid. When exposed to sunlight and air, that fluid transformed, first into green, then blue, and finally into a brilliant, enduring purple. It was said that one had to crush tens of thousands of these shells to dye a single garment. The process was slow, laborious, and foul-smelling. The air around the dye workshops of Tyre and Sidon was thick with the stench of decay. Yet from that stench came beauty. The color, once set into cloth, never faded. It deepened with time, like a living ember. To wear Tyrian purple was to wear a piece of the sea. In ancient temples, priests draped their idols in it. In the palaces of Assyria, kings displayed it as a sign of dominion. Later, in Greece and Rome, it became the privilege of emperors alone. A thread dyed in Phoenicia could travel farther than any ship, crossing cultures and centuries, carrying with it the memory of its makers. The dye trade made Tyre the wealthiest of the Phoenician cities. It financed fleets, temples, and colonies. It allowed its merchants to negotiate with pharaohs and kings as equals. But beyond wealth, it gave the city something more enduring: identity. The Greeks believed the god Melkart himself had discovered the dye. They told of how he walked along the shore with a nymph who demanded proof of his devotion. A dog accompanying them bit into a shell and stained its mouth purple. The nymph was enchanted by the color, and Melkart, to please her, ordered garments dyed with it. Whether true or myth, the story captures something essential: the fusion of sea and soul, craft and divinity that defined Tyre's spirit. Every stage of the dyeing process required mastery. The shells were gathered in baskets, their secretions extracted and mixed with salt water, then left to ferment for days under the sun. The smell was unbearable, but the result was unmatched. Workers watched the color bloom, as if the sea itself were being reborn in their vats. The purple that emerged was not a single shade, but a spectrum, from soft lilac to deep crimson, each hue named and prized. Ships departed Tyre's harbors, carrying bolts of this cloth wrapped carefully against moisture. When the sails filled with wind, the city's wealth went with them, to Greece, to Egypt, to the rising empires of Mesopotamia. Wherever those sails appeared, they brought with them the scent of cedar, the gleam of glass, and the promise of a color unlike any other. Through this trade, Tyre's influence extended far beyond its island walls. Its merchants established outposts across the Mediterranean, each bound by loyalty and lineage to the mother city. They carried the cult of Melkart westward, founding temples to him wherever they landed. In this way, the dye and the deity traveled together, color and faith, commerce and spirit intertwined. Tyre's power was not measured in legions or conquests. It was measured in the reach of its reputation. Rulers sought its artisans, other cities imitated its wares. Even its rivals admired its ingenuity. To control the trade in purple was to command the language of prestige. But the dye was more than a symbol of wealth. It was a mirror of Phoenician philosophy. In it, we glimpsed their understanding of transformation, how from death could come beauty, from decay endurance, from the smallest of creatures a color fit for gods. It was an act of creation through patience, a craft that required listening to nature's rhythm. The Phoenicians did not force the sea to yield. They learned its secrets slowly, through observation and reverence. In this way, their industry was an extension of their worldview. The sea was alive, filled with mysteries that could not be conquered, only understood. Each wave carried possibility, each tide a lesson. The dye makers of Tyre, standing at their vats beneath the burning sun, were not just laborers. They were alchemists, turning water into color, impermanence into eternity. At its height, Tyre stood as the jewel of the Levant. Its walls gleamed white against the blue of the sea, its harbors crowded with ships from every corner of the known world. The chants of sailors mixed with the hum of traders, the crash of waves with the rhythm of hammers shaping bronze. Life pulsed there without pause, carried by wind and tide. Yet even as Tyre prospered, the seeds of impermanence were already sown. Wealth invites envy, mastery attracts imitation. Other peoples began to copy their dyeing methods, to trade along their routes, to speak in letters shaped from their script. The Phoenicians had given the world their gifts, but in doing so, they had ensured that the world would no longer need them. Still, the purple remained, enduring long after their ships vanished from the harbors. In Rome, senators would wear the broad purple stripe as a mark of office. In Byzantium, emperors would be born in the purple. Even today, the word royal carries the echo of that ancient hue. What began as the secret of a small island became the color of power itself. And behind that color, silent and unseen, stood the Phoenicians, the forgotten masters who turned the sea into art. Their kingdom had no borders, yet its influence reached every court and palace. Their greatest monument was not a temple or wall, but a color that time could not erase. And in the end, When we look back upon the purple of Tyre, we are reminded of what the Phoenicians truly understood, that beauty is fleeting, yet memory endures. That the sea, though it devours all things, also preserves them, in salt, in story, and in the shimmer of color that never fades. The waves still break upon the rocks where Tyre once stood in glory. The scent of the sea still lingers there, faintly touched by history. And if you walk along that shore at dusk, when the light turns violet and the water glows, you might catch a glimpse of the color they gave to the world, the last light of the Phoenicians burning quietly beneath the horizon. Long before ink met parchment, before words could be carried by paper or stone, memory lived in the human voice. History was sound, stories told around fires, trade agreements sealed by promise, prayers whispered to the wind. But sound fades. And as the Phoenicians crossed the sea, they discovered something that could endure where breath could not, the written word. From the decks of their ships to the markets of their ports, they needed a way to keep track of things, of what was bought and sold, who owed what, and which ports were safe or treacherous. Their world was wide, their journeys long, and their prosperity depended on precision. Memory alone was no longer enough. The old systems of the great empires, Egyptian hieroglyphs, Mesopotamian cuneiform, were magnificent, but heavy, complicated, and sacred. To master them was to join an elite priesthood. The Phoenicians, practical and patient, wanted something else. They wanted simplicity. And so, somewhere along their coast, between Byblus and Tyre, a quiet revolution began. Out of the older scripts of Canaan and Egypt, they distilled a new one, smaller, lighter, easier to learn. It was a script not for priests, but for people. A script made for sailors, merchants, and artisans. A script that could travel as easily as they did. 22 symbols, that was all. Each stood for a sound, not a word. Together, they could build anything. A name, a promise, a memory. For the first time, writing belonged to everyone who had a voice. The simplicity was profound. In other lands, scribes spent years learning hundreds of symbols. In Phoenicia, a child could learn to write before learning to sail. The alphabet, born from necessity, became a vessel of thought as versatile as their ships. With every voyage, it spread. Traders scratched it onto amphorae, carved it into stone tablets, inked it onto papyrus. Wherever the Phoenicians went, their letters followed, carried across harbors and generations. They wrote right to left, each line like a tide returning to shore. The oldest known examples were found at Byblus, carved into the sarcophagus of a king named Ahiram. The words are brief, a dedication to the dead, but their meaning endures. In their curves and lines, we glimpse the seed of the alphabet we still use today. The Phoenicians, as ever, did not proclaim their invention. They did not carve monuments to celebrate it, nor record their own triumph. They simply used it. It was the perfect expression of who they were, quiet, efficient, enduring. They did not seek glory in conquest. They found it in connection. The Greeks would later take those same letters and reshape them. They added vowels, gave them new names, and spread them further west. The Romans followed, adapting the Greek form into Latin. From there, the letters traveled into every language that would grow from Europe's tongue, from Spanish and French to English itself. Every word spoken in those languages carries within it the trace of the Phoenicians. Every book, every inscription, every written thought is, in part, their descendant. Imagine the moment when a Phoenician merchant, somewhere in the 9th century BCE, first pressed his stylus into soft clay to record a shipment of cedar beams or jars of purple dye. He could not have known that the marks he made would outlive empires, that one day entire civilizations would build their knowledge upon those same shapes. The alphabet was not just an invention of trade, it was an act of liberation. It freed language from the hands of the few and gave it to the many. It turned memory into a shared inheritance. The power of the alphabet transformed their world. It allowed them to keep records of transactions, to send letters across sea routes, to communicate between distant colonies. But it also changed how they thought. Once language could be written, it could be reflected upon. Once words could be preserved, ideas could travel farther than ships. For the Phoenicians, writing was not just a tool, it was a mirror. Through it, they saw themselves not as isolated city-states, but as part of a greater whole, connected by ink as well as by tide. The world began to listen differently. Egyptian scribes marveled at the efficiency of the new system. The Greeks, meeting Phoenician merchants along their coasts, adopted it eagerly, calling it Phoenicia Grammata, the Phoenician letters. Even the Hebrews, their near neighbors, shaped their own script upon the same foundation. From one small coast, a single idea rippled outward until it touched every shore. The invention of the alphabet marked the moment when the sea of human speech found its harbor. And as it spread, it carried with it the ethos of its creators: practicality, openness, adaptability. It is tempting to imagine the Phoenicians as traders only, men of profit and distance. But in this gift of writing, they proved themselves philosophers of the everyday. They saw that greatness could lie not in monuments, but in methods, not in power, but in precision. The alphabet democratized thought. For the first time, a farmer could record his harvest, a sailor could mark his route, a craftsman could leave his name. The written word ceased to be the privilege of kings. It became the possession of humanity. Even their gods were reshaped by it. In the temples of Baal and Astarte, prayers were carved into stone in Phoenician script. Names of the divine took form not as pictures, but as sounds, accessible, familiar, human. The gap between heaven and earth, between ruler and merchant, between the sacred and the common, grew smaller. The Phoenicians did not leave behind epics like the Greeks, nor histories like the Romans. Time and conquest erased most of what they wrote. Yet the form of their writing endures everywhere. It is in the letters of Homer, in the decrees of Caesar, in the poems and books and languages that followed. The irony is gentle, but profound. The people who gave the world writing left behind no written record of their own voices. Their words live only in ours, but perhaps that is fitting. The Phoenicians never sought permanence. Their genius was motion, the understanding that value lies in what travels, not what stands still. The alphabet was the purest expression of that truth. Like their ships, it was built to move across seas, across cultures, across time. Today, when we write, we still trace their legacy. Each letter is a remnant of their craft, each word a small echo of their journey. The lines on a page are the descendants of their waves. The alphabet, born from the needs of merchants, became the foundation of civilization. And in that quiet act, in the carving of 22 shapes upon stone, the Phoenicians gave humanity something greater than empire, the power to remember itself. Their purple faded, their cities fell, but their letters, simple, elegant, enduring, continued to speak across 3,000 years. If you close your eyes and listen to the sound of pen on paper, you can almost hear the sea. It whispers the same lesson they once knew, that words, like ships, are meant to travel. And in their motion, the memory of the Phoenicians lives on. As the sun set over the waters of the Levant, the Phoenicians watched its reflection stretch across the sea, a path of gold leading westward into mystery. Beyond that fading light lay lands uncharted, coasts unnamed, and wealth unclaimed. For a people who had built their lives on motion, the call of the horizon was irresistible. It began, as always, with trade. The forests of Lebanon had long supplied Egypt with timber, and the ports of Tyre and Sidon brimmed with goods from every corner of the known world. But as their ships grew stronger and their confidence deeper, the Phoenicians turned their gaze beyond familiar waters. The Mediterranean, once a circle of known islands and cities, began to expand in their minds. To the west lay Cyprus, with its copper mines. Beyond it, the great islands of Crete and Rhodes, and farther still, the sprawling peninsulas of Greece and Italy. Each voyage pushed the boundary of their world a little farther. Each harbor opened a new path, a new partnership, a new possibility. The Phoenicians were not driven by conquest or curiosity alone, but by necessity. Their homeland, though rich in forests and harbors, offered little in the way of metal or farmland. To survive, they had to move. They followed the trade winds and the whispers of other sailors, seeking the rare and the precious copper from Cyprus, silver from Spain, tin from distant, mist-covered islands beyond even that. In time, their routes stretched farther than any before them. They became the first to make the Mediterranean a single, continuous world. Their ships hugged the coasts of North Africa, where dunes met sea and the air shimmered with heat. They founded way stations on sandy shores and rocky promontories, small harbors that would grow into cities, Lixus, Utica, and later Carthage. Across the sea, they built settlements in Sicily, Sardinia, and the Balearic Islands. Every few hundred miles, another safe haven, another reflection of home. In Spain, near the mouth of a great river, they built Gadar, modern Cadiz, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in Europe. Here they found what they had long sought, silver, abundant and pure. The mountains of Iberia glittered with it, and the mines near Tartessos became a source of wealth beyond imagining. Silver for purple cloth, silver for glass and cedar, silver for words written on thin sheets of metal to be offered in temples far away. From Spain, some say they sailed farther still, past the narrow straits the Greeks would later call the Pillars of Heracles, the gates of the known world. Beyond lay the Atlantic, a sea no map could describe. The Phoenicians called it the Western Ocean, and for them it was both promise and peril. Few ancient peoples dared to cross it. The Mediterranean was enclosed, its edges known. The Atlantic was open, infinite. Yet the Phoenicians were sailors of instinct. They trusted the stars, the scent of the wind, the feel of salt on their skin. To them, the horizon was not an end, but a beginning. Legend speaks of one such journey, the voyage of Hanno the Navigator. Setting sail from Carthage with a fleet of ships, he passed through the Pillars and followed the coast of Africa southward, perhaps as far as Senegal or beyond. His writings, preserved later by the Greeks, tell of strange lands, dark-skinned peoples, great forests, and fires that burned at night along the shore. Some modern scholars think he may have seen the volcanic glow of Mount Cameroon. Whether all of it was true or not, it shows how far the Phoenicians were willing to go, farther than any people of their age. They were not conquerors planting flags, but traders planting trust. Every harbor they entered became part of a growing network, chain of light, stretching from the Levant to the edges of the known world. At each new site, they left traces, fragments of pottery, carved stones with their script, the faint outline of workshops and warehouses. Archaeologists have uncovered their presence in places once thought too distant, on the coasts of Morocco, in southern Spain, even on islands lost between continents. The evidence speaks softly but surely. They went farther than history first allowed them credit for. Their colonies were not ruled from afar, as later empires would rule. They were self-sustaining, families of traders and craftsmen who carried their gods and their customs with them. Each settlement was a miniature Tyre or Sidon, with its temple to Melkart or Astarte, its marketplace by the shore, its shipyards filled with cedar and rope. Carthage, founded by settlers from Tyre in the 9th century BCE, would become the brightest jewel of these western colonies, a city that would one day rival Rome itself. But in these early centuries, it was one among many, a child of the sea learning to find its own voice. Through this westward expansion, the Phoenicians transformed the Mediterranean from a boundary into a bridge. The sea no longer separated cultures, it connected them. The Greeks, the Egyptians, the Libyans, and the Iberians began to share not just goods, but ideas. Artisans in one land learned techniques from another. Languages absorb each other's words. Myths crossed from one shore to the next, changing shape like reflections in moving water. In this sense, the Phoenicians were the first true mediators of civilization. They did not dominate. They connected. Their genius was in seeing that the world was already whole, that every culture, every shore, was a piece of a larger mosaic, waiting only to be joined. They brought to the West not only trade, but transformation. Along the Spanish coast, they introduced new forms of metallurgy. In Sicily and Sardinia, they shared shipbuilding techniques and artistic styles. On the North African shore, they mixed with local peoples, creating new cultures that blended Eastern and Western traditions. Their presence was quiet, but enduring. Centuries later, when Greek and Roman ships ruled the sea, they would still sail into harbors that had once flown the Phoenician flag, their names echoing faintly in the local tongues. The Western voyages were not just journeys of distance. They were journeys of identity. As the Phoenicians moved farther from home, their language, their customs, and their beliefs adapted to the places they touched. Yet through it all, the sea remained their constant, their mirror, their road, their memory. Imagine a Phoenician ship anchored off the coast of Spain as the sun sank beyond the Atlantic. The sailors sit on deck, the air filled with the scent of salt and pine tar. One traces letters onto a tablet by lamplight, recording the cargo, the price of silver, the name of a local chief. Another watches the horizon, wondering what lies beyond. Behind them lies the world they know. Before them, the endless blue. They did not know that their voyages would shape the future. They only knew the present, the creak of wood, the pull of current, the whisper of the wind through the ropes. The Phoenicians sailed until their roots became the arteries of a living sea, a body of water that pulsed with human motion. Through them, the Mediterranean became more than geography. It became civilization itself. Their western voyages carried the spirit of connection to the very edge of the known world. And even when their sails vanished over the horizon, their influence lingered in the ports they built, in the languages that borrowed their words, in the invisible lines of trade and trust that still link continents today. In time, others would follow their wake, the Greeks, the Carthaginians, the Romans, but it was the Phoenicians who first taught the world how to move west with purpose. They had no empire in the usual sense, no single flag or capital, yet the reach of their journeys was vast and enduring. The sea was their territory, the wind their ally, the horizon their home. And when we look today at the map of the Mediterranean, at the spread of cities along its edge, we are seeing the ghost of their design, a network of harbors born from their courage to sail beyond sight of land. Their empire was not drawn in stone, but in salt water, invisible, fluid, eternal. There is a moment in every civilization when a distant colony becomes something more than an outpost, when the echo of home begins to speak in its own voice. For the Phoenicians, that moment was Carthage. Far to the west of Tyre, beyond the familiar coasts of the Levant and the islands of the Aegean, a small peninsula jutted into the Mediterranean like a hand reaching toward the setting sun. The land there was fertile, the sea rich, and the winds kind. On that shore, sometime in the 9th century before our era, settlers from Tyre built a city. They called it Carthage, the new city. In time, the world would know it by another name, Carthage. Its founding, like so many beginnings, became legend. The Greeks told a story of a queen, Dido, or Elissa, a princess of Tyre, who fled her brother's tyranny and sailed west with a band of followers. When she arrived on the coast of North Africa, she asked the local ruler for as much land as could be enclosed by a bull's hide. Cleverly, she cut the hide into thin strips and laid them end to end, encircling a hill called Byrrhus. There she built her city, destined to rival the mightiest powers of the ancient world. History, stripped of myth, tells a simpler truth. The settlers who came from Tyre were merchants and sailors seeking new opportunities, new harbors, and safer access to the rich trade of the western Mediterranean. The site they chose was perfect, a natural double harbor, easy to defend and close to major sea routes between Sicily, Sardinia, and Spain. The soil yielded grain and olives. The nearby hills offered stone and timber. From this foundation, Carthage rose swiftly, not as a child of Tyre, but as its heir. The architecture of the early city reflected its ancestry. Houses of sun-baked brick-lined narrow streets that wound upward toward the citadel. Warehouses clustered near the water's edge, filled with goods from every corner of the Phoenician world. Silver from Spain, ivory from Africa, tin from the islands of the north. Temples crowned the hills, most notably the Temple of Melkart, the same god who ruled over Tyre. His cult traveled westward with the settlers, the fire in his temple a flame carried across the sea. But Carthage was not a mirror of the homeland. It was something larger, an evolution. The city stood at the crossroads between worlds, the desert and the sea, Africa and Europe, the old Phoenician East and the new western frontier. Its population grew not only with settlers from Tyre and Sidon, but with locals, Berbers, Libyans, and others drawn by trade and opportunity. From this fusion of peoples came a culture both familiar and new. The Carthaginians spoke the same Semitic tongue as their ancestors, wrote in the same script, and worshipped the same gods. But their outlook widened. They were not just traders among others. They were builders of a maritime realm that spanned continents. The Mediterranean, once the world of their ancestors, became their domain. The harbors of Carthage were unlike any others. Protected by great sea walls, they formed two concentric circles, one for merchant vessels, the other for the warships that would later guard their trade. From above, they must have looked like the eyes of the city itself, gazing endlessly upon the sea. At the center of the inner harbor stood an island, ringed with docks and workshops. There, shipwrights worked day and night, maintaining a fleet that could be ready to sail at a moment's notice. In time, this fleet would be the envy of the Mediterranean. But in these early centuries, it served a different purpose, to protect commerce, not to seek conquest. Carthage's wealth came from trade, and trade required safety. Its ships patrolled the sea lanes to Spain and Sardinia, ensuring that the goods of the Western world flowed steadily eastward. Through Carthage, the Phoenician network reached its greatest extent. Silver from the mines of Iberia, copper from Cyprus, ivory from the African interior, gold from Nubia, and glass and dyes from Tyre, all passed through its markets. The city became the beating heart of Mediterranean exchange, its warehouses filled with the riches of 3 continents. Carthage also carried forward the Phoenician genius for diplomacy. Its merchants made treaties with local tribes, securing access to resources without the need for war. Its leaders forged alliances with neighboring states, balancing power through trade rather than force. Where others conquered, Carthage negotiated. Where others built empires of land, Carthage built an empire of sea routes and trust. The city's prosperity transformed its people. They became known not only as traders, but as master craftsmen, shipbuilders, and navigators. Carthaginian artisans refined the glasswork of their ancestors and created delicate jewelry of gold and electrum. They sculpted ivory into figures of gods and animals, wove fine textiles, and produced pottery that blended Phoenician tradition with African earth. Their religion, too, evolved. The old gods remained, Baal, Astarte, Melkart, but new forms of worship appeared, shaped by the city's unique position. On the hill of Byrisa stood a great temple complex, where rituals of renewal and thanksgiving were performed to ensure prosperity. The sea, as always, was sacred. The harbor was an altar as much as a port. Yet beneath this flourishing world lay a tension, the same tension that had always defined the Phoenicians. Carthage depended on trade, and trade depended on freedom of movement. As it grew, so did the envy of others. Greek colonies dotted Sicily and southern Italy, their influence spreading westward. Etruscan ships challenged Carthaginian merchants in the Tyrrhenian Sea, and to the north, on the small Italian peninsula, a village on the Tiber River was slowly rising, Rome. For now, these powers coexisted, bound by trade and distance. But the sea that united them would one day draw them into conflict. Still, in its prime, Carthage was the living proof that the Phoenician spirit could survive and thrive far from home. When Tyre and Sidon came under the shadow of the Assyrian and later Babylonian empires, Carthage remained free, a beacon of the old ways. In its ships, its merchants, and its language, the voice of Phoenicia continued to speak long after the homeland fell silent. The city grew wealthy beyond measure. Its markets overflowed with goods from every land. Its harbors gleamed with the masts of hundreds of ships. Travelers described it as the jewel of the Western Sea, rich, confident, alive. Even the Greeks, often rivals, spoke of its prosperity with respect. But Carthage, like all great powers, would find that wealth comes with shadow. To protect its trade, it would one day build an army and wield its fleet as a weapon. To preserve its freedom, it would one day wage wars as devastating as any the world had seen. In doing so, it would carry the legacy of Phoenicia into its final tragic act. For now, though, Carthage stood in peace, a city of sails and markets, of smoke rising from temples and songs rising from harbors. The sun set over its twin ports, and the sea reflected the glow of thousands of lamps, as if the stars themselves had descended to dwell within its waters. The Phoenicians had always been wanderers, their lives bound to the rhythm of the tide. But in Carthage, they found something they had never known before: permanence. A home built not against the sea, but with it. And in that city's rise, the story of Phoenicia entered a new chapter, one that would carry their name into the heart of history, and, through fire and loss, ensure that it would never be forgotten. The sea was their map, their road, their market. Across its vast and shifting face, the Phoenicians built something that had never existed before, a living network of exchange that touched every shore and bound the world together with invisible threads of trade. This was not empire as others knew it. It had no soldiers, no borders, no single ruler. It was an empire of motion, kept alive by trust, skill, and the rhythm of commerce. Aboard their ships, life followed the pulse of the waves. Each morning began with the sound of ropes tightening, sails unfurling, and the creak of cedar hulls against water. The decks smelled of salt and tar, of resin and smoke from the cooking pots. Sailors and merchants worked as one, some mending nets, others checking amphorae filled with oil or wine, still others repairing oars or inspecting cargo tied down beneath woven mats. The Phoenicians were meticulous. Every plank of their ships had meaning. The hulls were built broad to hold more weight, yet curved to cut the water cleanly. Rows of oars could carry them when the wind died, and the raised prow, carved with symbols of guardianship, parted the waves like an offering. They carried the wisdom of centuries of shipwrights, each generation improving upon the last, until their vessels became the envy of every mariner. Inside the cargo hold lay the wealth of many worlds. Cedar wood, its scent sharp and sweet. Glassware glowing in the half-light. Fine textiles woven in purple and gold. Silver ingots from Spain. Ivory tusks from Africa. Spices whose names would one day fill legends. Each item told a story of miners deep in mountains, of artisans hunched over furnaces, of forests felled and rivers crossed. The Phoenician merchant was not simply a trader of goods, but a messenger of human endeavor. They sailed not alone, but in fleets. A small convoy might leave Tyre bound for Egypt, Cyprus, or Crete, each ship carrying a share of goods to be exchanged along the way. One would carry timber and glass, another oil and wine, another the precious purple-dyed cloth that only kings could afford. They would stop at ports known from generations of charts, sometimes unloading, sometimes bartering, sometimes merely resting until the weather turned. At every harbor, they were recognized. The sight of a Phoenician sail was a promise, not of conquest, but of opportunity. Markets would stir, crowds would gather, and the sound of many tongues would rise like music. Merchants came from inland villages bringing grain or hides. Fishermen traded their catch for pottery or tools, and rulers sent envoys to negotiate for cedar beams or silver. The Phoenicians were the bridge between worlds, the living tide that connected kingdoms and tribes that might otherwise never have met. On board, the rhythms of life were simple and constant. The sea demanded discipline, and the sailors answered. Days were long and quiet, only the wind, the oars, and the voices of men singing to keep time. At night, they navigated by the stars. The North Star was their anchor, Orion and the Pleiades their companions. The sea's silence was vast, broken only by the whisper of waves against the hull and the soft creak of ropes swaying with the current. Meals were humble, bread, dried fish, olives, and wine. But the camaraderie of the voyage made them sacred. Around the embers of a small brazier on deck, the sailors told stories of storms survived, of strange lands where rivers ran silver, of gods who watched over them unseen. The ocean, they said, was alive, a being with moods and tempers, kind one day, cruel the next. They respected it as they respected the gods themselves. When storms came, they faced them with ritual calm. Sails were lowered, ropes tied tight, and the crew worked in silence. Each man knew his place, each gesture practiced until it was instinct. In those moments, survival depended not on strength, but on trust. And when the storm passed, when the dawn light revealed the water calm again, they would offer thanks to Baal or Melkart, pouring wine into the sea as tribute to the power that had spared them. The Phoenicians understood better than any people before them that trade was not merely the exchange of goods, but of understanding. Each voyage carried more than cargo. It carried the knowledge of one shore to another. Pottery from Greece appeared in Egypt, Egyptian faience in Spain, amber from the far north in the markets of Tyre. Cultures that had never met began to share shapes, colors, and words, subtle transformations carried in the wake of their ships. Through commerce, they taught peace. For those who traded together seldom waged war. The Phoenicians' reputation as honest brokers made them welcome in lands where others were not. They spoke many tongues, and their diplomacy was as refined as their craftsmanship. They could bargain with a Greek artisan in one port, a Libyan chief in another, and a Hebrew king in the next, moving through the Mediterranean as easily as the wind itself. To them, the sea was a body, and they were its bloodstream. Every port was a heartbeat, every voyage a breath. They moved goods, yes, but also memory, art, and faith. Even their gods traveled with them. Temples to Melkart and Astarte appeared wherever they docked, small sanctuaries that faced the same horizon as those at home. Offerings made in Spain might echo prayers spoken in Tyre. Across thousands of miles, belief itself became a bridge. In this way, the Phoenicians turned trade into culture. The Mediterranean, once divided by fear and distance, became a single shared world. Their success rested on an invisible code: fairness, reputation, and the sanctity of promise. A merchant's word was his life. A debt unpaid or a contract broken could follow him from one end of the sea to the other. It was this trust, more than wealth or weapons, that sustained their empire. In their ledgers, simple wooden tablets coated with wax, they recorded the pulse of civilization. Cargoes sold, prices set, routes completed. These lists, forgotten by time, were the foundation of global economy. Through them, the first accounting systems emerged. Through them, humanity began to measure itself in exchange, not of conquest, but of cooperation. Even their silence was commerce. When the wind fell and the sails hung limp, when the ship drifted under a vast and empty sky, they would sit and wait, listening. The stillness of the sea became a teacher. It reminded them that patience was as vital as movement, that nothing, not even progress, could exist without calm. Centuries later, when other empires rose, Greek, Roman, Byzantine, they would inherit this ocean of commerce. They would claim its roots and ports, its systems and ships. But the pattern was Phoenician, the rhythm theirs. The invisible web of exchange they wove still underlies the modern world. The belief that trade can unite what distance divides, that the movement of goods can become the movement of ideas. When the Phoenicians looked upon the horizon, they did not see separation, they saw possibility. Every voyage began as an act of faith, that the sea, though vast and unpredictable, could be understood. That people, though different in tongue and custom, could be reached. Their ships no longer sail, their names fade from maps, but the world they imagined, a world connected by exchange and trust, remains. If you listen to the rhythm of a harbor today, the sound of cranes and engines, the creak of hulls, the call of voices in many languages, you are hearing an echo of them. The pulse of the ancient sea endures, steady and familiar, the heartbeat of a civilization that taught the world how to move together. The Phoenicians built no empire of conquest, yet they changed the shape of the earth. Through trade, they gave humanity its first glimpse of global connection. Through patience, they made the sea our shared inheritance. And through silence, the silence of waves breaking softly against the hull, they taught us that movement, when born of understanding, becomes peace. The sea has always been a meeting place. Upon its shifting surface, civilizations approached each other, not with armies, but with sails. And in that long dawn of the first millennium before our era, two peoples came to share the same waters, two cultures who would together define the world to come. One looked eastward from islands of marble and light, the other westward from cedar-covered mountains and harbors of bronze. The Greeks and the Phoenicians met upon the sea, and the Mediterranean became their common language. By the time Greek sailors ventured confidently beyond the Aegean, Phoenician merchants had already traced the outline of the known world. Their ships were older, their routes longer, their harbors more numerous. To the Greeks they seemed ancient even then, mysterious traders from the east speaking in strange accents, their holds filled with goods that gleamed in the sun, glass that caught the light like frozen water, purple cloth, rich as sunset ivory, and silver that spoke of distant lands. The Greeks called them Phoenicians, the red people, perhaps for their dye, perhaps for the glow of their homeland at dusk. They admired them, feared them, imitated them. And though they were rivals, they were also mirrors of each other, both restless, curious, drawn by the sea's promise of motion. Along the coasts of the Aegean and Anatolia, Phoenician traders set up small stations, not colonies in the later sense, but temporary markets where they could exchange goods with the rising Greek city-states. Here, language and barter intertwined. A Phoenician might offer cedar planks for olive oil, or fine glass for copper. In return, he might take home pottery painted with scenes of heroes and gods, the earliest meeting of two artistic worlds. From these exchanges, something subtle began to happen. The Greeks, who had long admired the beauty of Egyptian art and the power of Near Eastern craftsmanship, now had direct contact with the culture that linked them both. Through Phoenician trade, the East entered the imagination of Greece. From Phoenicia came motifs that would later adorn Greek temples and vases, the lotus, the griffin, the palmette. From Phoenicia, too, came knowledge of shipbuilding and navigation, of weights and measures, of writing. For it was through this contact that the Greek world first encountered the alphabet. Traders and scribes from Tyre and Sidon, taught the Greeks how to shape their own language with Phoenician letters. The Greeks, ingenious and restless, adapted them, adding vowels, refining forms, but the roots remained the same. To write in Greek was, in a sense, to write in Phoenician memory. Herodotus, centuries later, would remember this debt. He wrote that the Phoenicians brought to Greece the alphabet, which the Greeks used with little alteration. He did not exaggerate. The very letters that would later spell the names of Homer, Plato, and Aristotle began as marks scratched by Phoenician merchants recording shipments of cedar and silver. Trade between the two peoples grew, but so too did competition. As the Greeks founded their own colonies in Sicily and southern Italy, they entered waters once ruled solely by Phoenician ships. The sea became a stage for both cooperation and rivalry. On some islands, Greek and Phoenician merchants shared harbors. On others, they faced each other across narrow bays, wary but respectful. The Greeks admired the Phoenicians' mastery of commerce. The poet Homer speaks of them often as cunning traders, expert craftsmen, bringers of treasures from across the sea. In his Odyssey, the Phoenicians are both admired and distrusted, their skill seen as both blessing and temptation. They were, to the Greek mind, symbols of the world's vastness, proof that beyond familiar shores lay lands of wonder and wealth. Yet behind admiration lay tension. The Greeks, driven by hunger for land and fame, began to expand westward. Their ships reached Sicily, then Italy, then the coasts of Gaul and Spain, waters that Phoenician merchants had long considered their own. Slowly, the balance shifted. The Phoenicians, once the sole masters of the Mediterranean's lanes, now shared them with rivals who sailed under different gods and dreams. But the encounter was not a clash so much as a dialogue. Greek artisans learned from Phoenician glassmakers. Phoenician sailors borrowed Greek methods of fortification and trade. On the island of Cyprus, Greek and Phoenician communities lived side by side for centuries, their languages and customs blending until they became inseparable. In that fusion, the Mediterranean found its true character, not a battlefield, but a mosaic. As Greek philosophy looked inward, toward reason, form, and the human soul, Phoenician wisdom looked outward, toward exchange, connection, and endurance. One sought truth through thought, the other through motion. Yet both, in their different ways, reflected the same longing, to make sense of the world, to turn chaos into pattern. The sea gave them that pattern. The same stars that guided Phoenician ships guided Greek ones. The same winds that filled Tyrian sails filled Athenian ones. The same harbors that welcomed one would, in time, welcome the other. Through their encounters, ideas began to flow more freely than goods. The Greeks, who would later shape the intellectual foundations of the West, built part of that foundation upon Phoenician stone. The very notion of a connected, knowable world, a cosmos, owes something to the traders who linked its parts. To the Phoenicians, this meeting with the Greeks was simply part of the sea's rhythm. They had met many peoples before, and would meet many more. But to the Greeks, it was transformative. From these Eastern sailors, they inherited not only letters, but a way of seeing the Mediterranean as a single living whole. In time, the Greeks would surpass them in fame. Their poets and philosophers would fill the world with their voices. Their histories would be written and remembered. The Phoenicians, quieter and more transient, would fade into the margins of those stories, their contributions acknowledged but half forgotten. Yet the two peoples remained forever bound, their legacies entwined like the currents of the sea they shared. The sea by Zeus begins on the Phoenician coast. The story of Cadmus, the legendary founder of Thebes, tells of a Phoenician prince who brought with him the art of writing. In the language of imagination, as in history, Greece and Phoenicia were never strangers. When the sails of Greek ships gleamed alongside those of Tyre and Sidon, the Mediterranean reached its first true moment of unity. East and West looked upon each other, not yet as enemies, but as reflections, one discovering what the other had long known, that civilization grows not in isolation, but in exchange. So the Phoenicians, who once taught the world how to move, now taught it how to meet. The sea between Greece and Phoenicia remains the same today, a corridor of light, a mirror for memory. The winds that once carried their voices still whisper across its surface. And though the names of their ships and captains have been lost to time, the legacy of their meeting endures every time we speak, write, or think in the alphabet they shared. Theirs was not a rivalry of destruction, but of inheritance. And through it, the Mediterranean became the first true world, one sea, one shared horizon, one unbroken conversation between peoples. Every civilization, no matter how fluid or far-reaching, must one day face the weight of empires. The Phoenicians, masters of motion and exchange, could not escape that truth. For centuries they had moved freely across the sea, untouched by the ambitions of kings. But the tide of history turns for all, and from the east it brought armies whose shadow would fall over the cedar coasts of Lebanon, Assyria, Babylon, and Persia, the giants of the ancient world. Their arrival marked a new chapter, one of endurance rather than expansion. The Phoenicians had built their greatness not upon conquest, but upon connection. Now they would learn to survive amidst empires that ruled through domination. Yet even under the weight of foreign crowns, their harbors remained alive, their ships still sailed, and their culture, resilient and supple as rope, continued to bind the Mediterranean together. The first storm came from the north. Around the 9th century BCE, the Assyrians began their rise, a people of iron and empire who carved their dominion across Mesopotamia. Their kings, from Assurbanipal to Tiglath-Pileser, demanded tribute from every nation within reach. The Phoenician cities lay upon the coast like jewels upon a thread, gleaming, desirable, and vulnerable. Assyria coveted their wealth, their timber, their ports, and their ships, but conquest by land was never easy. The mountains guarded the coast, and the cities, though small, were fortified and fiercely independent. So the Assyrians waged war by pressure, demanding tribute rather than destruction. Tyre, Sidon, and Byblus each made uneasy peace, sending gifts of cedar, gold, and purple cloth to Nineveh. Their kings bowed, but their ships remained free. For the Phoenicians, subservience was not submission. They had learned the art of survival in a world of giants. When the Assyrian armies came, they paid what was demanded, and when the armies marched away, they returned to the sea. The empire of Assyria could rule the land, but it could not rule the waves. Assyrian inscriptions boast of victories over the cities of Phoenicia, of kings who bent the knee and brought tribute in abundance. Yet those same records praise the Phoenicians, ships, vessels of extraordinary design that the conquerors themselves came to depend upon. For the Assyrians, whose strength was in armies, the Phoenician fleets became essential. They used them to transport timber, soldiers, and tribute across the sea. The conquered had become indispensable to their conquerors. Thus began a pattern that would define Phoenician history, a delicate balance between obedience and autonomy. They survived by adaptation. Where brute strength would have shattered, flexibility endured. But empires fall as surely as they rise. When Assyria collapsed in the late 7th century BCE, its ruins were still warm when another power swept in, Babylon. Under Nebuchadnezzar II, the Babylonians extended their reach across the same lands, inheriting both Assyria's glory and its hunger. Tyre once again found itself besieged. For 13 years, the Babylonians tried to break the island city, surrounding it with their fleets, cutting off trade, demanding surrender. Yet Tyre held. Behind its massive sea walls, defended by courage and ingenuity, it resisted until the Babylonian armies withdrew in frustration. A treaty followed, harsh perhaps, but not fatal. Tyre retained its merchants, its ships, and its spirit. In their quiet, the Phoenicians knew what the Babylonians did not, that the city's true strength lay not in walls but in water. As long as the sea existed, so too would they. When Babylon fell to Persia, a new era dawned. Cyrus the Great, founder of the Achaemenid Empire, understood what others had only tried to exploit, that the Phoenicians were not a people to be crushed, but a power to be embraced. The Persians ruled vast lands stretching from India to the Aegean, yet they lacked one essential thing: mastery of the sea. For this, they turned to the Phoenicians. Under Persian rule, the Phoenician cities entered a golden age of partnership. Their fleets became the backbone of the Persian navy, their sailors the pilots of imperial ambition. When the Persians invaded Greece in the 5th century BCE, it was Phoenician ships that carried their armies across the sea. The same waters that had once been their refuge now bore the weight of empire. Yet even in service to Persia, they remained themselves. The Persians did not erase their culture or impose their gods. They demanded tribute and allegiance, but in return granted freedom of trade. The Phoenicians thrived in this space, semi-independent, prosperous, trusted. Their harbors flourished, their artisans found new patrons. Their letters and language continued to flow through the channels of empire. In the grand capitals of the Persians, from Susa to Persepolis, carvings depict Phoenician envoys bringing tribute: logs of cedar, jars of wine, vessels of glass. They stand among Egyptians, Greeks, and Indians, one among many peoples of the empire, yet distinct, the mariners of the world, recognized for their gifts of craft and connection. This was their genius, to find freedom in dependence, to weave continuity through change. Even so, the world around them was transforming. The Greeks, once students of Phoenician navigation, were now masters of their own ships. Their colonies dotted the Western Sea. Their thinkers were redefining the relationship between power and philosophy. And in the East, Persia's might began to waver under the strain of its vastness. The Phoenicians, ever watchful, adapted again. They served whichever power could preserve their trade, shifting allegiance as the tides demanded. They understood that no empire was eternal, but commerce could be. In this, they were not opportunists but realists, navigators not only of water, but of history. By the time Alexander of Macedon marched out of Greece, the Phoenicians had lived under empire for 500 years. They had seen kingdoms rise and fall, but their cities still thrived, their merchants still sailed, their alphabet still spread. The cedar forests might have thinned, but the spirit that had once carried them to the ends of the sea remained unbroken. It was said that when Alexander arrived at the gates of Tyre, he sought peace first. He knew the city's legacy, its skill, its wealth. But the Tyrians, proud and independent to the last, refused him. And so the young conqueror, who dreamed of uniting the world, found himself facing the last great stronghold of the ancient mariners. The siege that followed would become one of legend, but that story belongs to another tide. For now, the Phoenicians stand at the threshold of change, poised between freedom and conquest, between memory and oblivion. They have survived the Assyrians, endured the Babylonians, served the Persians. They have bent but not broken, adapting as the sea itself does, shifting form, never losing depth. Their history in these centuries is not one of defeat, but of quiet triumph. Where empires carved their names into stone only to vanish, the Phoenicians wrote theirs in water, and it endures still. They proved that power is not always strength, that permanence can dwell in motion. Their cities may have paid tribute to kings, but their ships remained free, crossing boundaries no empire could truly control. In their survival lies a lesson as old as the sea, that those who understand the flow of the world can outlast those who try to dam it. The Phoenicians were the tide between empires, sometimes serving, sometimes resisting, always moving. And through it all, they carried something indestructible, the memory of freedom written in the rhythm of the waves. When the Persians came, they brought with them not only conquest, but order. To the battered lands of the Near East, weary from centuries of war and siege, they offered a kind of calm. And for the Phoenicians, that calm meant something precious, the freedom to sail. Under the great kings of Persia, Cyrus, Darius, Xerxes, the Phoenician cities of Tyre, Sidon, Byblus, and Arwad found themselves folded into an empire unlike any before it. The Persians did not crush their subjects beneath the weight of uniformity. They governed through tolerance, allowing each people to live according to its own customs, gods, and trade. For the Phoenicians, this arrangement was ideal. They could prosper within the safety of empire while keeping their own rhythm, the rhythm of the sea. Cyrus the Great, whose armies swept from the mountains of Iran to the shores of the Mediterranean, understood their value. His empire needed ships. It needed sailors who knew the waters, who could move armies and goods from Egypt to Anatolia, from the Levant to the Aegean. And no one knew the sea as the Phoenicians did. The relationship was mutual. The Phoenicians gained protection for their ports and access to a market that stretched farther than any they had ever known. In return, Persia gained a navy that could move with speed and purpose. The empire became a vast organism, and the Phoenicians were its bloodstream. Under Darius I, the empire reached its zenith. Roads and messengers connected its lands by earth, while Phoenician ships bound them by sea. From the harbors of Sidon and Tyre, fleets carried supplies, soldiers, and tribute. In the port of Byblus, shipwrights built vessels of cedar for the king's navy. Persian officials praised their craftsmanship, how the hulls curved perfectly to the waves, how the sails held firm against the strongest winds. In carvings on the walls of Persepolis, we still see them. Phoenician envoys bring in gifts, logs of cedar, jars of purple dye, delicate glass, and intricately wrought metalwork. They stand shoulder to shoulder with envoys from Egypt, India, and Greece. The empire recognized them not as subjects to be tamed, but as partners in the great machinery of civilization. Sidon, especially, flourished. Its harbor bustled with activity, its merchants rich beyond imagining. Temples rose in honor of Baal and Astarte, blending local stone with Persian design. Sidonian kings, loyal to the great king, were rewarded with autonomy and wealth. Tyre, though proud and independent, also prospered, its ships forming the backbone of the imperial navy. For nearly 2 centuries, Phoenicia thrived under Persian rule. Their trade routes expanded further than ever before, reaching the shores of India through Persian intermediaries. They carried goods across oceans of sand and water, spices, silk, gems, incense, each journey another link in a chain that encircled the known world. The Persians saw in them something rare, a people whose loyalty could be earned not through fear, but through respect. The Phoenicians had no desire for rebellion. Their hearts belonged to the sea, not to kings. As long as their harbors remained open and their ships free to sail, they would serve faithfully. When Xerxes prepared his great invasion of Greece in 480 BCE, it was the Phoenicians who built and manned his fleets. Hundreds of ships from Tyre and Sidon joined the armada that crossed the Hellespont, a vast, living procession of oars and sails. Greek writers, watching from their own coasts, marveled at the sight. Ships from every corner of the empire, but none more finely crafted or more skillfully handled than those of the Phoenicians. Herodotus, chronicler of that war, praised them reluctantly but sincerely. The Phoenicians, he wrote, were the best sailors in the king's fleet. Their helmsmen steered with precision. Their rowers kept perfect rhythm. Their captains understood both storm and strategy. In the battles that followed, at Artemisium and Salamis, they fought with courage, though the tides of war turned against Persia. When the Persian navy was shattered by Greek cunning and geography, many Phoenician ships went down with it. Yet even defeat could not undo centuries of mastery. They returned to their harbors and rebuilt, as they had always done. Empires might lose battles, but the sea does not keep score. The Persians, pragmatic as ever, did not punish them. They knew the failure had not been the sailor's fault, but the king's ambition. So Phoenicia continued to prosper, its people moving fluidly between loyalty and autonomy. Their cities remained wealthy, their gods unshaken, their trade uninterrupted. In those years, the Phoenicians stood at the crossroads of cultures more than ever before. Greek merchants began to arrive in their ports, bringing not only goods but ideas. Persian officials oversaw their commerce, but also admired their independence. Egyptian craftsmen traded materials and motifs, their art mingling with Phoenician glass and metal. The result was a society of astonishing diversity, a meeting ground of east and west, of empire and sea. The alphabet that the Phoenicians had once created now flourished across this interconnected world. Greek letters, derived from their own, returned to them carved upon marble and pottery. The world they had once knitted together through trade now began to speak in the same written tongue, a subtle victory greater than any conquest. But beneath the calm of Persian rule, the world was changing. To the north, Greece had found its voice, proud, restless, and ambitious. To the west, Carthage, their daughter city, had grown powerful and independent. And within the Persian Empire itself, cracks began to show. The cost of expansion strained its vast resources. The balance that had allowed so many peoples to coexist began to tilt. Still, in those last peaceful decades, the Phoenicians enjoyed a final flowering. Their temples gleamed with offerings. Their markets overflowed with goods. Their ships crossed every sea known to man. They had lived through the rise and fall of Assyria, Babylon, and now Persia, and each time they had endured. They had turned service into strength, adaptation into art. To the Persians, they were subjects. To themselves, they were still free, free in the only way that mattered, upon the water. From the decks of their ships, they watched the sun set beyond the horizon, its reflection stretching westward, toward lands they had already reached, toward stories yet to unfold. Perhaps they sensed that another storm was coming, that one more empire would soon rise from the west to challenge the old order. But if they did not fear it. They had outlasted empires before. The Phoenicians lived by a truth as ancient as the tide, that the world changes, but the sea endures. Empires might rise on the backs of armies, but they crumble in time. The ocean remains vast and patient, carrying memory across its depths. And in that Persian horizon, in the calm between conquest and chaos, the Phoenicians found a brief eternity. Their sails still glowed in the light of dawn. Their gods still listened to prayers whispered into the wind. Their letters still marked the flow of trade and the reach of thought. For 200 years, they thrived under the greatest empire the world had yet seen, not as servants, but as navigators of empire itself. They had once taught the world to move. Now they taught it to connect. And soon they would teach it one last lesson: how to face the end of independence with dignity, and how to leave behind a legacy so deep that even conquest could not drown it. There are journeys that remain etched in history, and others that fade into legend. Somewhere between the two lies the story of Hanno, the Carthaginian navigator who sailed beyond the edge of the known world. His voyage stands as the farthest echo of the Phoenician spirit, the unending urge to see what lay beyond the horizon, to follow the sea wherever it might lead, even into the unknown. The world he set sail from was already vast. By the 5th century BCE, the Phoenicians and their Carthaginian heirs had charted nearly every coast of the Mediterranean. Their ships crossed from Syria to Spain, from Cyprus to Sicily, from North Africa to the Pillars of Hercules, the straits we now call Gibraltar. Beyond those narrow waters lay another sea, darker and wilder, the great Atlantic, the ocean without walls. Few dared to enter it. To the ancients, it was the boundary of the world, the place where the sun sank into fire. But Hanno dared. The voyage began at Carthage, that proud city of harbors and sails, of markets alive with the noise of trade and the scent of cedar and salt. Hanno commanded a fleet of 60 ships, each carrying men, women, and supplies. These were not raiders, nor mere merchants, but settlers and explorers. Their mission was to sail beyond the Pillars and establish colonies along the western coast of Africa, to bring new lands into the great Phoenician web of commerce. When the fleet passed through the straits, the Mediterranean ended, and the unknown began. The water changed, the currents stronger, the tides more forceful. The air smelled different, the light sharper, the sea vast and unending. Behind them lay the calm blue of the inland world. Ahead, the open breadth of the Atlantic. Their first landfall came near the modern coast of Morocco. There, at a bay sheltered by cliffs, they founded a colony, Tyrian. It was the first of many. From there, they sailed farther south, hugging the coast, naming the capes and rivers as they went. They established new settlements where the land allowed, each one a fragment of Carthage planted upon the edge of Africa. But Hanno was not content merely to settle. He pressed onward. His ships moved past the familiar sands of the Sahara into lands lush and green. He described rivers teeming with crocodiles and hippopotamuses, creatures unlike any they had known before. The coast grew humid, the forests thick and dark. The sailors heard strange cries from the trees and saw fires burning upon distant hills. The stars above them were no longer the same constellations they had known in the northern sea. To the sailors, this was a journey into myth. To Hanno, it was a voyage of knowledge. He recorded what he saw carefully: the shape of the land, the habits of the people, the color of the soil, the constellations of unfamiliar stars. His account, later translated by the Greeks, survives in fragments. It tells of islands where people fled from the sight of the ships, of mountains that smoked at night, and of a place where the air was thick with heat and the sea glowed red. Some modern scholars believe Hanno reached as far south as Senegal, perhaps even to the volcanic slopes of Mount Cameroon, the chariot of the gods, as the ancient text calls it. If so, his fleet traveled more than 3,000 miles beyond the Pillars of Hercules, farther than any Mediterranean sailor before him, farther than any would again until the age of exploration. 2,000 years later, the voyage was not without peril. Storms lashed the ships. Supplies dwindled. In one passage, Hanno describes a terrifying night when his fleet anchored near a shore lit by great flames. The sailors heard the sound of drums and shouting, saw figures dancing in the firelight. They fled, fearing the gods of the land. The coast of Africa, with its endless forests and thunderous waves, seemed a living presence, wild, ancient, indifferent to their purpose. Yet they continued. Each day, the horizon unfolded new colors, new sounds, new life. The Phoenicians had always believed the world was boundless, that the sea was the pathway between all things. Hanno's voyage was proof, a testament to their faith that movement itself was sacred. When the fleet could go no farther, they turned back. The heat, the lack of provisions, and the endless line of coast convinced them that the edge of the world was not to be conquered, only known. They retraced their route, stopping at the colonies they had founded, replenishing water and food before sailing home to Carthage. Hanno brought back more than maps and names. He brought stories of lands where rivers were wide as seas, where mountains breathed smoke, where the night sky blazed with unfamiliar stars. He brought proof that the world was larger than any empire could dream. When his account was inscribed on tablets in Carthage and later translated into Greek, it captured the imagination of generations. Some called it myth, others history. But to the Phoenicians and their descendants, it was something else entirely. A hymn to the sea, a reminder that their destiny was not conquest, but discovery. Hanno's journey embodied everything the Phoenicians had always been. They were not bound by land or language, but by curiosity. Where others saw boundaries, they saw roads. Where others feared the horizon, they saw home. Even now, when we read the few surviving lines of his voyage, we can feel that spirit. The steady rhythm of oars, the wind filling cedar sails, the flicker of starlight upon dark water. Hanno's fleet vanished into time, but the legacy of his journey endures in silence, in the unseen knowledge that the sea has no end, only endless beginnings. For the Phoenicians, each voyage was a prayer, not to reach a destination, but to understand the world's immensity. They believed that by knowing the sea, they could know something of the divine. And in Hanno's journey, that faith was fulfilled. Carthage would one day wage wars, raise armies, and fall to Rome. But long before its towers turned to ash, it had already achieved something far greater. It had carried humanity beyond the known. The voyage of Hanno is more than history. It is memory. A memory of sails filled with courage, of men and women who looked into the unknown and saw not fear, but promise. It reminds us that exploration does not begin with ambition, but with wonder, and that every horizon crossed adds another line to the story of who we are. When we look at maps today and trace the outline of Africa's western coast, we follow in the wake of those ancient sailors, their course still visible in the imagination of time. The wind they felt still blows across the same waters. The stars they followed still shine in the same sky. And somewhere in that vast expanse between myth and truth, the spirit of Hanno and his crew still moves with the tide, an eternal reflection of the Phoenicians' greatest gift to the world, the courage to sail beyond sight of land. Every civilization leaves behind its monuments of stone. The Phoenicians left behind something quieter, a faith written not in walls or idols, but in gestures, offerings, and wind. Their religion, like their ships, was bound to the elements, to water, to flame, to the eternal rhythm between destruction and renewal. In their temples and their harbors, the spiritual and the worldly flowed together, inseparable as tide and shore. To understand them, one must begin not in a sanctuary, but at the edge of the sea. There, where the salt air mingles with cedar and the sound of waves never ceases, stood the heart of their devotion. Every Phoenician port was also a temple. The harbor itself was sacred, the meeting place of earth and ocean, the border between the seen and unseen. Before a ship set sail, the sailors poured oil into the water and whispered prayers to the gods. Before the first oar struck the sea, an offering was made: wine, bread, incense, or a handful of grain. It was not ritual born of fear, but of respect, a recognition that their lives were held in balance by forces larger than themselves. Their pantheon was vast and ancient, shaped by centuries of exchange with neighboring lands. To the north and east, it shared roots with the gods of Canaan. To the south, it blended with the divinities of Egypt. But through it all, the Phoenicians gave their deities a maritime soul, reflections of the sea's dual nature, giver and taker, calm and storm. At the center stood Baal, lord of the heavens and master of rain and fertility, the bringer of storms, the sustainer of crops, the voice of thunder that rolled from the mountains to the sea. His worship joined earth and sky in a single rhythm, rain falling from heaven, flowing through rivers, feeding the harbors where life began. Beside him stood Astarte, goddess of love, war, and the evening star. She was known in other tongues as Ishtar, Aftereth, Aphrodite, but to the Phoenicians she was the sea's reflection in human form. Her temples overlooked the water, her altars crowned with incense and shells. To her, sailors prayed for calm seas and safe returns. To her, mothers prayed for children and lovers for reunion. And there was Melkart, the god of Tyre, builder, hunter, protector, and symbol of renewal. He was the city's heart, its eternal fire. Every year his death and rebirth were celebrated with processions that echoed the rhythms of nature, decay followed by growth, loss followed by dawn. In Melkart's story, the Phoenicians found comfort in the cycles of the sea, the knowledge that even after the fiercest storm, calm returns. In Sidon, they revered Eshmun, god of healing, the physician of the soul. His sanctuary stood among gardens and flowing springs, where pilgrims came to be purified by water and prayer. And in Byblus, ancient even by their standards, they worshipped Balat Gebal, the Lady of Byblus, guardian of writing and wisdom, patron of the city that had once sent cedar to Egypt's pharaohs. Her temple rose above the harbor, white and timeless, watching the ships come and go like the beating of a heart. These gods were not distant abstractions. They were companions, living presences in daily life. The Phoenicians did not separate the sacred from the practical. A merchant making a bargain, a mother weaving cloth, a sailor repairing his mast, all acted under divine witness. The world itself was holy, alive with unseen order. The rituals were simple but profound. Incense and wine were the languages of offering, fire and water the instruments of devotion. At sunrise, priests tended altars facing the sea, their prayers rising with the wind. At night, when the stars emerged, families left small tokens at household shrines, clay figures, amulets, lamps shaped like boats. Their faith, like their culture, was one of continuity. The same rites that blessed a ship's departure might also honor a harvest or a birth. Every act was part of a cycle: creation, voyage, return. In that sense, their religion mirrored their lives, an endless dialogue between movement and homecoming. The sea itself was their greatest teacher. They saw in its tides the heartbeat of the divine, patient, powerful, ever returning. The calm surface and the storms beneath were both sacred truths. Life, they believed, was the same, fragile and vast, perilous and beautiful. To live well was not to escape uncertainty, but to move within it gracefully as a ship moves with the wind. In their temples, great columns rose from the earth like masts, and sacred fires burned beside pools of water. Flame and tide, opposites bound in harmony, symbolized the balance of all things. Some scholars believe the eternal fire of Melkart's temple in Tyre burned without interruption for centuries, its smoke mingling with the scent of salt and cedar resin. Sailors returning home would see it long before they saw the city itself, a beacon of faith and belonging. There were darker aspects too, as in all ancient religions. In times of crisis, famine, war, plague, offerings became desperate, prayers more urgent. Later writers, especially the Greeks and Romans, accused the Phoenicians of terrible sacrifices. Whether truth or exaggeration, these stories reflect the depth of their belief that the gods were intimately tied to fate, that to neglect them was to invite ruin, and to honor them was to keep the world in balance. Yet more often, their worship was a celebration of life. Festivals marked the turning of seasons, the arrival of new ships, the memory of ancestors. Processions filled the streets, music echoed from harbors. Offerings were cast into the waves. Faith was not a retreat from the world, but an embrace of it. Their temples stood wherever their ships went. In Cyprus, in Malta, in Sicily, in Spain, even on the far coasts of Africa, small shrines faced the sea, their altars aligned with the sunrise. The same prayers that rose from Tyre echoed in Carthage and beyond, a chorus of faith carried by wind and water. Through religion, as through trade, the Phoenicians created unity, not through conquest, but through reverence. Their gods were not jealous of place or tongue. In foreign lands, they adopted new names, new symbols, merging with local deities. Melkart became Heracles to the Greeks. Astarte became Venus to the Romans. The divine adapted, as the people did, crossing boundaries with ease. Even as their identity faded into history, their gods endured, changed in name, but not in essence. In the quiet of their faith lies the secret of their endurance. The Phoenicians believed that what is fluid survives, where what is rigid breaks. Their religion, like their ships, was built to move, to bend with the wind, to float upon uncertainty. It asked for balance, not certainty, for humility, not conquest. When we imagine their harbors at dusk, the temples glowing with firelight, the sea reflecting the stars, we can almost feel what they must have felt. The vastness of the world, the smallness of human life, and the grace of belonging to both. Their gods, like their memory, have scattered across time. Yet the essence remains, a faith born from the meeting of earth and water, a reverence for the eternal motion of things. In every ship that leaves port, in every candle lit upon the water, in every prayer whispered to the wind, there is something of them. They, ancient mariners who saw divinity not above them, but around them in the rhythm of the waves and the breath of the world. For the Phoenicians, art was not luxury. It was language. Every curve of wood, every shard of glass, every thread of dyed cloth spoke of who they were, a people who saw divinity in precision and memory in the act of making. To them, craft was the mirror of creation itself. The gods shaped the world. The artisans shaped the world's reflection. Their cities were alive with sound and skill. In the narrow lanes of Tyre and Sidon, hammers rang on bronze, chisels whispered against stone, and furnaces glowed like captured suns. Shipwrights, carpenters, jewelers, and glassmakers worked side by side, their craft sustained by the rhythm of the sea. Trade brought them the finest materials, silver from Spain, gold from Egypt, ivory from Africa, lapis and alabaster from the East. From these they built beauty that traveled farther than their ships. Nowhere was their genius clearer than in glass. Long before Rome perfected its glassblowing, the Phoenicians had already mastered the mystery of molten sand. They took the simplest of substances, silica, soda, lime, and with heat and patience turned it into light itself. In the workshops near the harbors, furnaces roared day and night. Artisans gathered glowing threads of glass upon long rods, turning and shaping them into beads, bowls, and amulets. When cooled, the pieces shimmered like captured sea foam, blue, green, and gold, translucent as water. To hold a piece of Phoenician glass was to hold the essence of their homeland, the clarity of the sky, the depth of the sea, the warmth of the sun. Traders carried it to Greece, to Egypt, to Mesopotamia. In the tombs of pharaohs and the ruins of palaces, archaeologists still find their handiwork, proof that beauty, when shaped by devotion, can outlive nations. Their craftsmanship extended beyond glass. They were renowned as woodworkers, no surprise in a land of cedar. The forests of Lebanon, sacred and fragrant, provided timber of unmatched strength. From it they carved ships, furniture, and sculptures that graced temples from Thebes to Babylon. Each piece bore the mark of their precision. Joints fitted so tightly they seemed to grow from one another, surfaces polished to a soft gleam. To shape cedar was to converse with the divine. Every stroke of the adze released its scent, a fragrance older than memory. In metalwork, too, the Phoenicians excelled. They learned the secrets of smelting from the Hittites and improved upon them. Bronze, copper, silver, and gold flowed through their furnaces, becoming jewelry, vessels, and tools of exquisite delicacy. They etched their surfaces with lines of inlay, geometric motifs, and symbols of the gods, lions, lotus flowers, sun disks. Even the smallest object carried the balance of opposites, strength and grace, function and art. Their textiles were equally renowned. From Tyrian workshops came the purple-dyed cloth that clothed kings. But alongside the famous purple, they wove fabrics of many colors, blues and greens from indigo and malachite, scarlets from madder and kermes. The looms clacked softly in the courtyards as women and men worked together, the threads glowing in the sun. Cloth was not just commodity, it was expression. Each pattern, each hue, was a signature, a whisper of identity carried across the world's waters. Even their coins and seals bore the marks of art. On them were engraved ships with curved prows, the symbols of Melkart, palm trees, and rising suns. These small images, carried from hand to hand, became ambassadors of culture, portable prayers in metal form. The Phoenicians' artistry was not born in isolation. It absorbed and transformed everything it touched. From Egypt, they borrowed motifs of the lotus and falcon. From Mesopotamia, the winged bull and rosette. From Greece, the harmony of proportion. Yet what they created was always uniquely their own. Where others sought perfection through dominance, the Phoenicians sought it through blending. Their art was a confluence, a conversation between worlds. In Byblos, ancient craftsmen adorned temples with ivory panels, carved so finely that the grain of the material disappeared. Figures of gods, dancers, and animals flowed together in quiet rhythm, not static, but alive. In Sidon, artisans cut gemstones with precision, so sharp that even the Persians envied them. And in Carthage, sculptors molded clay into forms of serene dignity, fusing Phoenician grace with African earth. Their aesthetic was subtle, yet profound. It valued balance over boldness, continuity over novelty. Like the sea they worshipped, it shimmered rather than shouted. The beauty of their work was in its restraint, the sense that each object, no matter how ornate, held within it a silence, a reverence for the material from which it came. To the Phoenicians, craft was also a form of remembrance. Each act of making preserved the world as it was, while transforming it into something enduring. A piece of glass, a carved amulet, a woven thread, all were fragments of immortality. The artisan, like the sailor, knew that his work might travel farther than he ever would. In that way, art became their truest voyage. Their cities reflected that same sensibility. Unlike the colossal monuments of Egypt or Mesopotamia, Phoenician architecture was human in scale, functional, graceful, alive with light. Their temples opened toward the sea, their courtyards filled with water and greenery. Stone met wood, wood met bronze, and each material retained its own voice. Theirs was a world built not to intimidate, but to invite. It is easy to forget that much of what we know of them comes from fragments, a broken vase, a buried necklace, a shard of colored glass. Yet even in pieces, their art speaks clearly. It tells us that they understood beauty as an act of harmony, not control. That to craft something well was to honor both matter and maker. In a world obsessed with conquest, they offered another kind of legacy, the quiet endurance of creation. Empires fell, temples crumbled, but their work remained, delicate yet indestructible, carried by wind and time to every corner of the earth. The Greeks and Romans would later adopt their techniques, their styles, even their symbols. And though the names of the artisans were forgotten, their spirit continued in every amphora that caught the light, in every thread dyed deep with color, in every ship carved from cedar that crossed a sea. When one stands today before a piece of ancient Phoenician glass, the centuries dissolve. What remains is the same shimmer, the same breath of the sea trapped in transparency. Their art was not merely an object, it was an atmosphere, a memory of motion made still. For a people whose lives were bound to water, permanence was found not in monument, but in craft. The ship might sink, the harbor might silt, but the thing made by hand endures, carrying within it the trace of touch, the echo of faith, the soul of the maker. The Phoenicians understood that to create was to remember. Every object they shaped was an answer to the sea's eternal question: how do you hold on to what is always moving? Their answer was simple: you make. And through making, they became immortal. The sun rose each morning over Carthage in a blaze of gold, and the sea answered it with silver light. The city awoke to the cry of gulls, to the sound of hammers from the docks, to the low hum of 1,000 traders opening their stalls. In those hours, the harbors of Carthage were the beating heart of the Western world. The ships of the city stretched to the horizon. Cargo vessels from Spain heavy with silver, triremes sleek as blades, fishing boats bobbing near the quays. The twin harbors, one for commerce, one for war, formed the city's soul. From above, they looked like eyes gazing eastward toward Phoenicia, as if still watching the homeland that had given them life. By the 5th century BCE, Carthage had become more than a colony. It was the empire Phoenicia had never sought but had somehow created, an empire of trade and sea, of knowledge and endurance. Its fleets ruled the western Mediterranean. Its markets brimmed with goods from 3 continents. Its artisans, its merchants, its priests, all spoke with the accents of Tyre and Sidon, but their gaze was turned west, toward the Atlantic wind. The Carthaginians inherited the Phoenician genius for connection and gave it new form. They built alliances with local tribes, forged treaties with Greek cities, and extended their influence across North Africa, Sardinia, Corsica, and Sicily. They planted new colonies, each one a living echo of the mother city, each one facing the sea. Utica, Hippo, Hadrumedum, Gades, their names became a constellation of Phoenician light across the western sea. At the center of it all stood Carthage, queen of commerce. From dawn until dusk, her markets pulsed with motion. Caravans arrived from the interior, bringing ivory, gold, salt, and slaves. Ships unloaded grain, wine, and timber. The air was thick with the mingled scents of spices, tar, and incense. In the city's warehouses, goods from Africa, Iberia, and beyond the Pillars of Hercules changed hands, traded, weighed, recorded, and sent again to distant ports. Trade was their lifeblood, but organization was their strength. Carthage was not chaos. It was order in motion. The city's council, made up of merchants and nobles, managed every aspect of its empire. They kept detailed records of goods and treaties, collected tariffs from colonies, and financed expeditions that reached even beyond the known world. In the delicate art of balance between profit and politics, they were unmatched. Their fleet was their shield. The harbor of war, circular and hidden behind high walls, could house hundreds of ships. At its center rose a small island with workshops, armories, and command quarters. The ships, triremes, quinquiremes, swift scouts lay ready for launch at any hour. Each berth opened directly into the inner basin, allowing an entire fleet to slip into the sea like a single creature. It was said that the sound of their oars in unison was like thunder rolling across the water. Their admirals, trained from youth, learned not only the art of combat, but the patience of the tide, how to wait for wind and current, how to trap an enemy fleet as one might close a net. Yet for all their might, Carthage's power was not born of conquest, but of necessity. The city had little farmland and few natural resources. It lived by trade. To survive, it had to control the sea. To control the sea, it had to defend it. War, for the Carthaginians, was not hunger for glory. It was the price of endurance. Their rivals understood this too late. The Greeks of Sicily, proud, ambitious, wary of Carthage's reach, began to view the Western Phoenician world as a challenge. Between the 6th and 4th centuries BCE, a series of conflicts broke out between Carthage and the Greek colonies of Sicily. Armies marched, fleets clashed, and for the first time in centuries, Phoenician ships sailed not as merchants, but as warriors. Still, the spirit of the sea remained within them. Even in war, they fought with discipline and strategy, not destruction. Their admirals sought to preserve routes, not burn them. The sea, after all, could not be conquered, only navigated. At home, Carthage thrived. Its engineers built aqueducts and reservoirs. Its farmers mastered irrigation and crop rotation, turning even poor soil into abundance. Its people lived in houses of stone and timber, decorated with mosaics and painted plaster. Temples to Baal Hammon and Tanit crowned its hills, places of worship where the flame of the gods burned day and night, reflecting across the water like stars brought to earth. Carthage was a world of both grandeur and grace. Its citizens dressed in linen and fine wool, its streets lined with colonnades. Scholars from Greece marveled at its governance. Merchants from Egypt admired its wealth. And yet beneath its success lay a quiet melancholy, a sense that it carried something fragile, something inherited and irreplaceable. For Carthage was more than a city. It was the last great voice of Phoenicia. Tyre and Sidon had fallen under foreign rule, their harbors now paying tribute to empires of land. But Carthage still lived by the rhythm of the waves. It was the sea's last sanctuary, the place where the old mariner's wisdom still guided the world. Its people never forgot their ancestry. Every spring, processions wound through the streets to the temples of Melkart, the god of Tyre. Offerings were cast into the sea to honor Astarte and Tanit, the mother of all life. In the songs of sailors, in the prayers of merchants, the names of the old cities still lingered, not as nostalgia, but as lineage. They spoke of the sea as their ancestor, and of the stars as their inheritance. The same constellations that had guided the first Phoenician voyages still watched over them. The same winds still carried their ships westward. The same desire to connect, to endure, to move still filled their sails. In the glow of Carthage's prosperity, it seemed as if the Phoenician spirit had found eternity. But beneath the calm surface, the tides of fate were shifting. To the north, a new power was stirring. A city on the Tiber River, once obscure, now restless and ambitious. Rome, like Carthage, would learn to build its strength upon the sea. And when two powers depend upon the same waters, the horizon can no longer hold them both. The time of peace was ending. But in this moment, before the wars, before the fire, Carthage stood at its zenith, proud, disciplined, luminous. The last and greatest child of Phoenicia, master of the Western Sea, guardian of a legacy that began on the cedar coasts of Lebanon and now stretched across half the world. When the wind swept across its harbors at dusk, the sound was not just the murmur of waves against stone. It was the whisper of history itself, the sea remembering the people who had given it meaning. The sea, which had once been the bridge between civilizations, now became a battleground. Two powers, born of different worlds yet reflections of one another, stood upon its shores. Carthage, heir of Phoenicia's maritime soul, and Rome, the restless force rising from the Italian hills. Both sought not merely survival, but mastery. Between them lay the future of the Mediterranean, and in that struggle, the last great chapter of the Phoenician story would be written. The Romans called the Carthaginians Peni, the people of Phoenicia, and so their wars would be, known as the Punic Wars. But beneath the name lay a deeper truth. This was not simply a conflict between two cities. It was a contest between two visions of the world. Rome, built on conquest and discipline, sought to command by land. Carthage, shaped by centuries of trade and tide, ruled by sea and by commerce. One saw power in walls and armies, the other in ships and exchange. For more than 2 centuries, the two worlds had coexisted, trading, negotiating, watching. Rome expanded across Italy, forging an empire from its alliances. Carthage watched from across the water, content in its wealth, its harbors, its freedom. But the Mediterranean could no longer contain them both. The spark came from Sicily, that fertile island where Greek colonies, Phoenician settlements, and local peoples lived in uneasy proximity. It was the heart of the sea, and whoever held it would control the routes that bound east to west. In 264 BCE, a small dispute between Sicilian cities drew in both powers. What began as a local quarrel grew into a storm that would rage for over a century. The First Punic War, tested Rome's ability to master the element it least understood, the sea. Carthage entered the war confident, for its fleets had ruled these waters for generations. Its sailors were professionals, trained from youth. Its admirals seasoned by 1,000 voyages. Rome, by contrast, had almost no navy. But Roman determination was a force as relentless as gravity. Within a few years, the Romans built their own fleet, hundreds of ships modeled upon a captured Carthaginian vessel. To offset their inexperience, they devised a strange innovation, the corvus, a boarding bridge that turned sea battles into land engagements. When the fleets met, the Romans grappled and boarded, transforming naval warfare into brutal, close combat. The sea, once Carthage's ally, betrayed it. After more than 20 years of war, years of shifting tides, sieges, and shipwrecks, Carthage sued for peace. It was a staggering loss. The proud city was forced to surrender Sicily, pay heavy tribute, and yield its claim to dominance. Yet even in defeat, Carthage endured. The sea was still theirs in spirit, and they turned their eyes westward, toward Spain, where new opportunities awaited. There, in the rich valleys of Iberia, Carthage rebuilt its strength. Under the general Hamilcar Barca, and later his son Hannibal, a new Carthage arose, one forged not only by trade, but by ambition. The Barcids built cities, trained armies, and gathered wealth from the mines of silver that glimmered beneath the Spanish hills. From this reborn power came the second great storm. In 218 BCE, Hannibal Barca, young, brilliant, and sworn from childhood to hate Rome, struck where no one expected. He led an army from Spain across the Pyrenees, through Gaul, and over the frozen Alps into Italy itself. It was an act of audacity that astonished the ancient world. With him came war elephants, soldiers hardened by years of conquest, and the unbroken will of a people determined to reclaim their destiny. For more than a decade, Hannibal ravaged the Italian peninsula. At Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and Cannae, he inflicted some of the worst defeats Rome had ever suffered. The earth drank deeply of Roman blood. Yet for all his brilliance, Hannibal could not deliver the final blow. Rome refused to yield. The city that had conquered Italy learned to endure, as the Phoenicians once had. Meanwhile, Carthage, ever cautious, ever mercantile, hesitated to send full support. Its council, wary of risk, measured costs even in war. The delay would prove fatal. Rome, resilient and methodical, struck back where Carthage was most vulnerable, in Spain, and finally in Africa itself. The final act came at Zima in 202 BCE. There, in the plains of Tunisia, Hannibal faced the Roman general Scipio Africanus. The battle was fierce and terrible, but the outcome was clear. Hannibal's elephants were turned against him, his lines broken, his army scattered. Carthage fell not by the sea, but by the sword. The Second Punic War ended with harsher terms than the first. Carthage was stripped of its navy, its colonies, its freedom to wage war. It was forced to pay enormous tribute, its power reduced to the boundaries of its walls. Hannibal, once the terror of Rome, became a wanderer, a relic of a vanished dream. Yet still, Carthage lived. Its people, descendants of sailors and merchants, turned again to trade. Within a generation, the city flourished once more. Its markets reopened, its harbors filled with ships. Rome watched in disbelief as the city it had defeated rose again from its ashes. It was said that the Romans began to fear not the Carthaginian army, but the Carthaginian spirit, that indestructible will to rebuild. In the Senate, the elder statesman Cato the Elder ended every speech, no matter the subject, with the same words: Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. The Third Punic War was not born of strategy, but of obsession. In 149 BCE, Rome returned to finish what it had begun. Carthage, exhausted yet proud, refused to surrender without resistance. For 3 years, the city fought alone against the greatest empire of its age. Men, women, and children took up arms. The harbors burned. The sea itself seemed to weep. When Rome finally breached the walls, Carthage was already ashes. The survivors were sold into slavery. The city that had once ruled the Western Sea was razed to the ground, its soil cursed, its memory silenced. But even in destruction, Carthage achieved what no conqueror could undo. The Romans absorbed its knowledge, its science, its seafaring, its trade. They rebuilt the city generations later, unable to resist the pull of its perfect harbor. Carthage became Roman in name, but Phoenician in soul, a ghost living inside the empire that had killed it. The Punic Wars ended the age of Phoenicia. The sea, once theirs, now belonged to Rome. Yet beneath the surface, their legacy endured. The alphabet that recorded Rome's laws came from Phoenician letters. The trade routes that fed Rome's wealth were laid by Phoenician hands. The very concept of empire by sea, of power through connection rather than conquest, was theirs. When the last embers of Carthage cooled, the world changed. The Mediterranean, which had once been a shared horizon, became a Roman lake. But the sea remembered. In every port, in every word written, in every ship that crossed from east to west, the echo of Phoenicia lingered. Carthage fell, but the idea of Carthage, the idea of the sea as a path to unity, could not be destroyed. It flowed onward, unseen but eternal, carried by the waves that had always been their truest home. The empire of the Phoenicians was gone, yet the world they had built endured. The end of Carthage came not as a single moment, but as a long extinguishing, the slow fading of light on the horizon. For centuries, the city had risen and fallen like the tide, battered yet unbroken. But even the strongest tide must one day recede. The sea that had once carried Carthage's glory now mirrored its final fire. It began with Rome's return. In 149 BCE, the legions crossed the sea with a purpose more absolute than conquest, annihilation. They came not to subdue, but to erase. To Rome, Carthage was no longer a rival in power. It was a rival in memory. It had to vanish so that the empire could believe itself eternal. By then, Carthage was no longer the empire of the West, but a city of merchants and farmers, cautious and industrious. It had abided by Rome's terms for half a century, rebuilding its wealth through trade and craft. The harbors once again filled with ships. The markets thrived. Carthage had turned its genius for endurance inward, making prosperity out of submission. Yet to Rome, this recovery was proof of defiance. The Senate demanded the impossible, that Carthage abandon its walls and move inland, leaving the sea forever. For a people whose soul was born from water, this was death. And so they refused. Rome declared war. The legions under Scipio Aemilianus, grandson by adoption of Scipio Africanus, landed upon the same shores where the armies of Hannibal had once stood triumphant. The siege began, a ring of steel around the city, cutting it off from the world. Inside the walls, the Carthaginians prepared not for victory, but for dignity. Every hand became a weapon, every street a barricade. The merchants who had once weighed silver now forged blades. The craftsmen who had shaped glass now built catapults from timber. Even the women and children labored, weaving slings, carrying stones, tending the wounded. The sea, their old ally, still offered food and escape, but the Roman blockade choked even that. Hunger crept through the alleys like smoke. For 3 years, the siege endured. Rome, patient and relentless, tightened its grip. The city resisted with the same faith that had once carried Phoenician ships across the unknown. But the world had changed. The spirit of trade could not withstand the machinery of empire. At last, in 146 BCE, the final assault came. Roman engines hurled stones through the air. Towers of flame advanced upon the walls. When the defenses fell, the legions poured in, street by street, house by house. The defenders fought with desperation, born not of hope, but of memory. They fought for every god, every harbor, every wave that had once borne their name. Flames rose through the city like dawn turned cruel. The great temples of Baal-Hamon and Tanit burned. The harbors that had once reflected the stars now glowed red with fire. The wind carried the scent of cedar, ash, and salt. It is said that the fire raged for 17 days, a second sun over the sea. In the final hours, when defeat was certain, the last citizens gathered in the temple precincts. They offered prayers, not for victory, but for remembrance. If the gods would not save the city, then let the sea remember it. Let the waves carry its name beyond destruction. Scipio Aemilianus watched from a distance as Carthage burned. Ancient historians say he wept, not for mercy, but for understanding. He saw in its fall the reflection of Rome's own fate yet to come. When asked what he felt as he gazed upon the ruin, he quoted the words of Homer, "The day shall come when sacred Ilium shall perish. Even conquerors know that all empires share the same horizon." When the smoke cleared, Carthage was gone. The Romans plowed salt into its fields so that nothing would grow. Its survivors were sold into slavery, its libraries lost, its temples turned to dust. For generations, its name was spoken only as a warning, Delenda est Carthago. Carthage must be destroyed, but memory does not burn. The sea, which had once carried their ships, kept their secrets. Beneath its surface lay the stones of their harbors, the anchors of their fleets, the shards of their glass. The water remembers what fire forgets. In time, even Rome could not escape the pull of that memory. A century later, when the empire hungered once more for trade and growth, they rebuilt Carthage upon the same ground they had cursed. The harbor walls were raised again, the markets reopened. The city lived anew, this time in Latin tongue, but Phoenician spirit. The Romans could destroy the city of stone, but not the city of the sea. The people of Carthage were gone, but their legacy moved silently through the veins of the conqueror. Roman merchants followed the same routes they had charted. Roman ships sailed with the same hulls they had designed. Roman letters, Roman law, Roman empire, all written in alphabets born from Phoenician hands. The world had not lost them. It had absorbed them. Even their gods lived on, renamed but familiar. Melkart became Hercules. Astarte became Venus. Tanit became Juno. In every new name, the old faith whispered beneath the surface. The divine, like the sea, changes its shape but not its essence. The fall of Carthage was not only an end, but a passage. The Phoenician story, begun on the coasts of Lebanon, had traveled across the world and through time. From Tyre to Carthage, from Carthage to Rome, from Rome to every shore that followed, their spirit flowed like a current, unseen, unstoppable. Theirs was the destiny of water, to be broken, scattered, yet always whole. And perhaps this is why their memory endures. Civilizations built upon conquest are remembered in ruin. Those built upon connection are remembered in silence, in the alphabet we write, in the words we speak, in the invisible threads that still bind one shore to another. Carthage burned, but Phoenicia never truly died. It became part of the world's bloodstream, flowing through languages, trades, and faiths. The sea, as ever, kept its promise. If one stands today upon the coast of Tunisia and watches the waves roll over the stones where Carthage once stood, the air still carries the scent of salt and smoke. The gulls cry above the ruins. The horizon glows with the same light that once guided their ships. It is as though the city still breathes beneath the water, patient, eternal, waiting for the world to remember. In that silence, the story of the Phoenicians ends as it began, with the sea and with the faint sound of wind against the shore, the voice of a people who taught humanity that to move is to live, and that even when the body of a civilization is lost, its soul continues to drift upon the waves. When the last Phoenician sails disappeared from the horizon, something else remained, quiet, weightless, indestructible. It was not a monument or a ruin, not a fleet or a fortress. It was a gift carried by breath and ink, a seed that would grow through every tongue that followed. It was the alphabet. The Phoenicians had always lived by simplicity, in trade, in craft, in language. For a people who spent their lives moving between lands and tongues, they needed a system that could travel as easily as their ships. The cuneiform of Mesopotamia was complex and heavy, the hieroglyphs of Egypt bound to sacred form. But the Phoenicians, ever practical, found a way to capture sound itself, to record speech and symbols that any merchant, sailor, or child could learn. Their invention was not born in palaces, but in harbors. It came from the needs of daily life, from the counting of cargo, the marking of debts, the signing of contracts between peoples who shared no common tongue. The alphabet was, in its essence, a tool of trust. Each letter was a bridge between speaker and listener, between trader and customer, between past and future. They took what earlier peoples had begun, the pictographs and syllables of the Canaanites, and refined them into something miraculous in its simplicity. A set of 22 signs, each representing a single sound. No more hundreds of symbols to memorize. No more sacred barriers between the literate and the unlearned. For the first time in history, writing belonged not to priests and kings, but to everyone who could hold a stylus. In the quiet of their workshops and warehouses, they changed the world. The letters themselves were humble, angular marks scratched into wood or etched into pottery, written from right to left. But within those shapes lay the foundation of human connection. Aleph, the ox; Beth, the house; Gimel, the camel, the remnants of a world where pictures became sounds and sounds became thought. From Phoenicia, the alphabet sailed across the sea like their merchants, reaching every coast that welcomed their ships. In Cyprus and Crete, in Greece and Italy, it took root and transformed. The Greeks, in their genius, added vowels, giving breath to the written word. From Greek came Latin. From Latin, the scripts of Europe. From those, the alphabets we use today. Every word we speak, every name we write, carries the faint echo of Phoenician hands. When a child traces the letter A, they are unknowingly redrawing the ancient symbol for Aleph, the ox head turned upright through centuries of use. The letter B still holds the memory of Beth, the house. The alphabet that orders our thoughts and preserves our memory is the invisible monument of their civilization, more enduring than stone, more far-reaching than empire. Through this invention, the Phoenicians accomplished what even Rome could not. They conquered time. Their ships sank, their temples burned, their cities crumbled, but their alphabets sailed onward, generation after generation, unbroken. The Greeks themselves knew the debt they owed. Herodotus wrote that the Phoenicians brought letters to Greece, and though the Greeks reshaped them, they never forgot their origin. The very name alphabet, from alpha and beta, still carries the breath of the old Phoenician tongue. Writing became the true inheritance of the sea. Just as the waves connected lands, so letters connected minds. The alphabet crossed not only geography, but history. It traveled through empires and religions, through languages and revolutions, adapting, transforming, yet never dying. It shaped law and scripture, poetry and science. It gave voice to prophets and philosophers, merchants and monarchs. It allowed the mind to speak across centuries, a continuity the Phoenicians themselves could only have imagined, yet somehow foresaw. For them, the written word was not sacred in isolation. It was sacred in use. Words were meant to move, from hand to hand, from city to city, from sea to shore. To write was to participate in the rhythm of exchange. Even their ledgers and contracts carried a quiet dignity. for they recorded what the gods themselves had set in motion, the act of giving, receiving, remembering. The alphabet was the perfect expression of their worldview, clarity without ornament, meaning without excess, connection without conquest. And so, even after their cities vanished, their language continued to speak through others. The Hebrew script, descended from theirs, preserved the prayers of prophets. The Aramaic alphabet, another branch, carried the words of empires and faiths from Babylon to Jerusalem. Through it, the alphabet of the Phoenicians became the root of Arabic, Syriac, and countless others. To trace the history of writing is to follow the wake of their ships. From the Levant to the Aegean, from Greece to Rome, from Rome to the far corners of the world, the letters flowed like tides, carrying the wisdom of those who first gave the sea a voice. Perhaps this was the true purpose of their civilization, not to rule, but to transmit. They were the world's translators, moving not only goods, but meanings. Their alphabet made possible the memory of all that came after. Without it, the poems of Homer, the laws of Rome, the scriptures of faith, and the chronicles of empires might have been lost to silence. Theirs was a legacy of quiet revolution, not of force, but of form. It is said that the gods of the Phoenicians faded when their temples burned. But the alphabet, that invisible flame, burned on. It outlived every idol, every empire, every storm. It carried within it the essence of their faith. That order can emerge from chaos. That meaning can cross the sea. That sound itself can become eternal. If we listen carefully, the letters still whisper. They tell of cedar forests and crowded harbors, of glass and bronze, of voices speaking in 100 tongues. They tell of the sea's eternal lesson, that nothing is truly lost, only transformed. Each time we write, we resurrect them. Each time we read, we honor them. For language is not only the memory of words. It is the memory of those who first believed that words could last. In this way, the Phoenicians achieved what all mortals dream of. They outlived themselves. They turned breath into sign, sound into structure, thought into permanence. Their ships are gone, but their alphabet still sails the vast ocean of time. Every page of every book, every word carved in stone or printed in light, is a continuation of their voyage. When we speak, when we write, when we remember, we are the Phoenicians sailing still. When the fire of Carthage cooled to ash, a new order settled over the Mediterranean. The sea, once free and polyphonic, now spoke with a single voice, Rome's. Yet beneath that voice, the old melody of Phoenicia still murmured softly, like a current beneath the waves. Rome called it Mare Nostrum, our sea. But the roots that bound it together, the very rhythm of its commerce, were Phoenician in origin. The harbors Rome rebuilt, the ships it sailed, the language it wrote in, all bore the traces of the people it had tried to erase. Under Roman rule, the Phoenician cities lived on, quieter now, but still breathing. Tyre, Sidon, and Byblus became provincial ports, their temples rededicated to Roman gods, their markets folded into imperial trade. Inscriptions from this time still bear the old names beside new ones, Latin mingling with Punic and Greek. The world had changed, but identity, like the sea, does not vanish. It transforms. The Romans admired what they had conquered. They rebuilt Carthage upon its ashes, turning it into one of the empire's greatest cities. Its harbors once again filled with ships. Its streets once again thrummed with life. The scent of olive oil, grain, and incense rose once more into the air. Carthage became Rome's gateway to Africa, its granary, its pride, the city that would one day nurture thinkers like Augustine, whose words carried both the Latin precision of empire and the meditative cadence of the sea. Farther east, in Phoenicia itself, the people continued their ancient crafts. They still made glass that shimmered like water. They still carved cedar and cast bronze. They still built ships that glided across the waves. Their gods lived on under other names. Melkart became Hercules. Astarte became Venus. Eshmon became Asclepius. The divine, like their language, simply adapted to new shores. But something deeper changed, the shift from independence to absorption. The Phoenicians had once been wanderers, merchants, translators between worlds. Now they became citizens of a vast empire that spoke for them. The sea that had once been their home was now a Roman highway, patrolled by Roman triremes, mapped by Roman law. A freedom that had defined them gave way to stability. The world they had shaped was now everyone's, and in that sharing, their distinctness faded. And yet, in that fading, their essence found permanence. Every market that thrived under Rome's peace was built upon their idea that commerce could be civilization. Every letter carved into Roman stone carried the alphabet they had created. Every ship that crossed from one end of the empire to the other followed paths they had first traced. Even the Roman calendar of faith, with its gods of love, war, and the harvest, echoed the balance of sky and sea once honored on the Phoenician coast. The Phoenicians had never sought empire. Their power had always been subtler, the power to connect, to teach, to move. That power endured long after their names were forgotten. In that sense, their disappearance was not tragedy, but fulfillment. The tide they had started had become the world itself. By the 1st century CE, few could have called themselves Phoenicians in name. The word had become a memory, a whisper among scholars, a trace in the lineage of cities. But in the rhythms of trade and language, in the quiet hum of markets, in the way the Mediterranean had become a single world, they were still there, unseen but present, like the undertow beneath calm water. The Romans, for all their might, could not escape their inheritance. Their empire was built on land, but its lifeblood was the sea, and the sea spoke Phoenician. The grain that fed Rome came through harbors first founded by sailors from Tyre. The glass that filled its villas glowed with techniques learned in Sidon. Even the idea of a Mediterranean civilization, a unity of many lands bound by trade and culture, was their creation. And when Rome itself began to falter, when the tides of history turned once again, that idea remained. Through Byzantium, through the caliphates of Arabia, through the merchants of Venice and the explorers of Portugal, the Phoenician seed continued to bloom. The world never stopped moving because they had taught it how. In the Levant, the land of their birth, the centuries folded upon one another. Empires rose and fell, Roman, Byzantine, Arab, Ottoman, and through them all, the people of the coast endured, adapting as their ancestors had. Their cities, built upon layer after layer of time, never ceased to face the sea. The harbors that once sent out ships of cedar now welcomed ships of iron. The markets that once sold purple cloth now traded silk and spice. The forms changed, but the rhythm did not. Perhaps that is the truest legacy of the Phoenicians, not monuments, but continuity. They taught the world how to live with change, how to see movement not as loss, but as renewal. Their story, even in its ending, is one of transformation, a reminder that disappearance is not the same as death. The Romans wrote their histories in marble. The Phoenicians wrote theirs in water. The marble remains, cracked but visible. The water flows on, reshaping, reflecting, eternal. If we look closely at the Mediterranean today, we can still see them. In the shape of harbors and ships, in the words we write, in the way commerce binds nations and cultures, in the simple belief that the world is connected, the Phoenicians are there. Their horizon may have faded, but their light has never gone out. In every letter traced upon a page, in every voyage launched upon the sea, they live. Their empire without walls became the foundation of a world without borders. Their fading was not disappearance, but diffusion. Their spirit dissolved into the bloodstream of civilization itself. The sea has no memory for nations, but it remembers motion. And the Phoenicians were motion, the first to trust the horizon, The first to make the unknown familiar, the first to prove that the world could be one. They did not vanish. They became everything. Listen, before the first empire rose, before the names of kings were carved into stone, before the world learned to measure itself in boundaries, there was only the sea, wide, breathing, eternal. It was here that the Phoenicians were born, and here that they returned. The sea remembers them. It remembers the scent of cedar carried by the wind, the rhythm of oars cutting through morning fog, the low chant of sailors greeting the dawn. It remembers the glint of bronze on the decks of their ships, the flicker of oil lamps guiding them through night waters, the laughter of traders bartering in a dozen tongues. It remembers the silence, too, the long, still hours between storms when the only sound was the whisper of waves against wood. The Phoenicians no longer have a homeland. Their cities lie beneath centuries of dust and stone, their temples fallen, their language silent. Yet their spirit moves still through the world, as steady as a tide. The alphabet they gave us shapes every word we speak. The trade routes they charted have become the arteries of civilization. The idea they embodied, that connection is stronger than conquest, has never died. They were a people of balance. Between land and sea, faith and reason, silence and speech. They understood that to endure, one must move. That to belong, one must share. They did not build empires of walls, but of wind and trust. In every age that came after, the world has needed them, the quiet makers, the unseen bridges, the hands that link one horizon to another. Even the sea that once carried them bears their likeness. It is patient, generous, and fierce when forgotten. It teaches what they taught, that everything flows, that nothing stands alone, that all things return to their source. If one could stand upon the coast where Tyre once rose and close their eyes, the sound would be the same as it was 3,000 years ago. The waves still murmur against the rocks. The air still smells of salt and sun. The sea still breathes. It is as if the centuries have folded back upon themselves, and time, like water, remembers. The Phoenicians never sought glory. They did not carve monuments to themselves. They left behind only the traces of motion, the wake of a ship, the shimmer of glass, the curve of a letter. Yet in those small, enduring things lies their greatness. For what is civilization, if not the sum of the quiet acts that bind lives together? They remind us that legacy need not shout to be eternal. The truest permanence is invisible. A thought carried forward, a skill handed down, a word written and read again. Their story is not of triumph and fall, but of continuity, a line unbroken across time. When Carthage burned, when the Romans marched, when the temples turned to dust, the sea remained. It received the ashes and carried them outward, scattering them across the waters they had once ruled. And in that scattering, something sacred happened. Their memory became the sea's own. Now, every ship that sails, every trade that crosses from one shore to another, every alphabet written, all are echoes of them. They are the hidden pulse beneath the modern world, the unseen rhythm in our speech, our travel, our exchange. History often remembers the loud, the conquerors, the destroyers, the kings. But the sea remembers differently. It remembers those who built with patience, who listened to the world's breath, who saw in every stranger a partner rather than a threat. It remembers the Phoenicians. Their lesson is simple and eternal, that the world belongs not to those who seize it, but to those who connect it. The sea knows no nations. It accepts every river, carries every ship, mirrors every sky. So did they. And perhaps that is why, though their names have faded, their presence has not. They are in every letter of our writing, in every harbor of our commerce, in every act of exchange between people who have never met. We speak their memory each time we say Alpha and Beta. We live their legacy each time a ship crosses from east to west. We honor them each time we look upon the horizon and see not distance, but possibility. In the end, The Phoenicians became what they had always been, a movement, not a people. They dissolved into the world like salt into water, unseen yet everywhere. And so the sea remembers, not with nostalgia, but with presence. Each wave that breaks upon the shore carries their whisper. We are here still. If the earth could speak, it might tell their story like this. There were once people who loved the sea so deeply that they taught it to speak in words. They carried not swords, but language, not conquest, but exchange. They sailed not to rule, but to understand. And when they were gone, the sea did not forget. It holds them still, in the depths, in the tide, in the soft murmur of foam against rock. It holds the memory of their courage, their patience, their quiet faith that the world could be bound together by trust. When night falls over the Mediterranean and the stars rise, one can imagine them still out there, phantom sails gliding beneath Orion, voices murmuring in forgotten tongues. Not ghosts, but guardians of memory. For as long as words are written, as long as ships cross water, as long as humanity seeks to know itself through connection, the Phoenicians will live. The sea remembers. And in remembering, so do we. When the Romans came, the harbors of Phoenicia still breathed with the scent of cedar and salt. Their ships, once the envy of the world, now served under foreign banners. The sailors of Tyre and Sidon hauled grain for new masters, their charts copied into Latin hands, their gods renamed or forgotten. Yet beneath the quiet submission of the ports, something continued to stir. The sea had always been their kingdom, and kingdoms built on water do not vanish when borders change. They dissolve, they drift, and they return in new forms. The Romans took the land, but not the horizon. They built temples where others had built warehouses, and in the long silence that followed, the waves carried away the last syllables of a people who had once named every shore they touched. The Phoenicians had no poets left to write their end, no chroniclers to mourn their passing. But if history is a tide, then every tide leaves its trace. Their legacy was not a ruin, but a rhythm, a way of moving through the world, quietly, persistently, without need for empire. Long after their names were buried, the alphabet they had shaped from the bones of older scripts went on speaking for them. Every letter that crossed a page, every sound that passed between human lips, carried a faint echo of those early traders who carved the first words of the modern world into stone and wood. Their alphabet became Greek, then Latin, then everything that followed, a chain of thought linking the Bronze Age to our own time. In that way, though their temples fell, their language survived in all others. They wrote no history, yet they gave the world the tools to write every history that came after. To sail was their prayer. To build a ship was to offer a gift to the sea. They understood what most civilizations forget, that water is not a boundary, but a bridge. They read the winds as others read scripture, and in the motion of the waves they saw not danger but continuity. Their cities were thresholds between worlds, places where stories met and exchanged names. A Phoenician port was not a nation but an idea, that life itself could be lived in motion, that identity could float, adapt, evolve, and never need to conquer. Even their gods were travelers. Melkart of Tyre, Astarte of Sidon, Baal of the storm and sea, their shrines stood beside docks, their altars smeared with oil and salt. They were worshipped by sailors who carried their images far beyond the horizon, leaving traces of their devotion on the coasts of Africa, Spain, Sicily, and perhaps even Britain. Wherever the ships went, the gods went too, crossing boundaries no empire could seal. In the quiet of foreign harbors, they listened to new prayers in strange tongues, changing as the people changed, never bound by one land or one name. Religion, like trade, was fluid, and the Phoenicians understood that fluidity better than anyone. In the centuries after their fall, the world forgot to see the sea as a home. It became instead a space to be crossed, a peril to survive. But the Phoenicians had seen it differently. For them, the sea was memory made visible, a mirror of the sky, a body that never dies, only transforms. Their ships rode that mirror, linking continents long before the world thought of continents at all. They were the bloodstream of a young world, learning how to breathe beyond its cradle. Even now, traces of their presence lie hidden in the language of sailors and the craft of navigation. The Phoenician keel, the curved hull, the ratio of mast to beam, these are the silent inheritances of their design. Every vessel that braves open water, from the triremes of Greece to the caravels of Portugal, owes its bones to them. The compass came later, but the courage to face the endless horizon that belonged to the Phoenicians first. Imagine the sound of their harbors at dusk, the creak of moored ships, the calling of gulls, the crackle of firelight against cedar, merchants counting coins beneath lamplight, children tracing letters on sand. The air thick with pitch and salt. Somewhere beyond the breakwater, a ship turns its prow toward the west, its sails swelling with the last light of the day. On board are amphorae of oil, ingots of tin, bundles of papyrus, small offerings carried across an immense silence. To sail from Tyre to Spain was to sail into legend, yet they did so without arrogance. For them, the journey itself was the reward, and return was never guaranteed. When night fell, the stars guided them. They read constellations like maps, naming each one as if it were a friend. To the north lay the pole star, constant, unwavering, but to a Phoenician navigator, every star had meaning, every flicker a direction. In their minds, the sky and sea were one continuous field of motion. They trusted in patterns the way others trusted in gods. That trust carried them through storms, through weeks of emptiness, through waters no one else dared to enter. They were explorers not of conquest, but of connection. Centuries later, when Greek and Roman historians wrote of them, they described them as cunning traders, elusive mariners, masters of purple dye. They wrote of their wealth and their secrecy, of their colonies and their fall. But none of them captured the quiet essence of what they were. To the Phoenicians, wealth was not the goal. It was the consequence of curiosity. They sought not power but passage. They did not build walls. They built routes. Their empire was made of wind and wave. In this, there is something profoundly human. Every civilization begins on a shore. Every people, at some point, stands before the unknown and chooses whether to step into it. The Phoenicians stepped forward, again and again. They left behind no great armies, no sprawling monuments, no grand declarations, only the trace of movement. And perhaps that is why their memory still feels alive. They were not bound to permanence. They understood that to endure, one must change shape, like water in the tide. As centuries rolled on, their cities became layers beneath layers. Roman columns rose above Phoenician foundations. Crusader castles later stood on Roman stones. Earthquakes shattered them all in time, leaving fragments of columns scattered along the beach. Tourists walk among them now, taking pictures in the same sun that once gleamed on bronze and cedar. Beneath their feet lie streets that led to the ancient sea. Time folds upon itself here, like a sail reefed against the wind. And the alphabet, that invisible monument, outlived every empire that tried to claim it. From the shapes the Phoenicians drew came Greek, from Greek came Latin, and from Latin came almost every written word you read today. The script you see now, the words that carry this story, descend from the same strokes once cut by a sailor in Tyre 3,000 years ago. You are reading their afterlife. Their memory passes not through myth, but through the motion of your eyes along a line of text. History has many ghosts, but few speak as intimately as this. The Romans, who ended their political life, also preserved parts of their soul. Phoenician glassmaking continued under Roman rule. Their purple dye still draped emperors. Even as they disappeared as a people, their crafts survived as luxuries. The cedar forests dwindled, The old ports silted, but the idea of the merchant sailor, the man who finds the world by moving through it, endured. Later ages would call such men explorers, navigators, even discoverers. But the truth is simpler. They were remembering what the Phoenicians had already known, that the horizon is never an end, only an invitation. Every civilization leaves something behind. Some leave cathedrals, others laws or languages. The Phoenicians left movement. Their true monument is the trade wind that still sweeps across the Mediterranean, the salt that crusts the lips of sailors, the pattern of routes that bind continents together. Their empire was never of land, but of distances bridged. Theirs was the first truly global dream, a dream that had no center and no edge. When modern archaeologists uncovered the ruins of Carthage, when divers found anchors off the coast of Cyprus, when inscriptions surfaced from dusty tombs in Byblus and Malta, they began to piece together a mosaic without a name. Each shard told of contact, of exchange, of hands meeting across the sea. In those fragments, the Phoenicians rose again, not as conquerors, but as connectors. They remind us that civilization is not built on victory, but on relationship. Look at the world now, the trade routes, the shipping lanes, the cables strung beneath the oceans carrying light and data. Each is a descendant of those first lines the Phoenicians drew across the map. The same principle endures, that distance can be overcome by courage and craft. In every container ship, every merchant vessel crossing the Strait of Gibraltar, their ghost still sails. Their story, like all great human stories, did not end with their disappearance. It diffused. It became the background hum of the world. Even their myths survive in disguise. The tale of Europa, carried across the sea by a bull, a Phoenician princess whose name the continent would inherit. The story of Dido, queen of Carthage, echoing through the verses of Virgil. Their memory persists not as fact, but as metaphor, a reminder that all beginnings are migrations, that all journeys reshape the world. In the end, they were swallowed by time, not because they were weak, but because they were fluid. The sea takes everything, yet in taking, it preserves. What sinks becomes part of the floor that supports the next voyage. What is lost becomes sediment, history layered in silence. The Phoenicians became that silence, a foundation beneath centuries of noise. When we speak of the ancient world, we speak upon their remains. Somewhere on the coast of Lebanon, a fisherman mends his net. The same wind that once filled Tyrion's sails brushes his face. The same stars burn above him. He does not know the names of those who once lived here, nor the words they spoke. But in his gesture, in the rhythm of his hands, something ancient moves. The sea is still his companion, as it was theirs. He lives within the echo of their choices, unaware that his own life is the continuation of theirs. Time does not erase. It transforms. Civilizations are not lost. They are absorbed, translated, reborn in forms unrecognizable to those who began them. The Phoenicians live in every script, in every ship, in every thought that crosses a boundary. They were among the first to show that to move is to be alive. Theirs was a philosophy of motion, and motion is eternal. When night falls over the Mediterranean, the horizon glows faintly with the memory of fire. Lights of modern cities trace the same pattern as the ancient ports. Planes cross the same air, once filled with sails. Beneath them, the sea keeps its secrets. If you listen closely, you might hear the creak of timbers, the faint splash of an oar, the ghostly hum of languages long gone. They are not gone. They are only beneath the surface. And perhaps that is the final lesson of the Phoenicians, that what matters is not how long a name survives, but how far its spirit travels. They reached the edges of the known world without needing to conquer it. They linked peoples who had never met, and in doing so, they stitched the first pattern of global humanity. Their map was not of power, but of connection. And connection, once made, never truly fades. History is a sea, and we are all adrift upon it, Some build walls against the tide, others learn to sail. The Phoenicians were sailors. They chose to move with time, not against it. And though the wind has changed, and the ports bear new names, the rhythm remains the same, the eternal exchange between land and sea, between what is remembered and what is forgotten. If you stand on the shore of Tyre today, at dusk the horizon will glow gold and violet, the same colors they once drew from the murex shell. The waves will reach your feet as they did theirs. And if you stay long enough, listening to the surf, you might begin to hear the faint heartbeat of the world before memory, the sound of oars, the whisper of sails, the endless call of departure. For the sea does not keep monuments. It keeps motion, and motion is remembrance. And so the sea remembers.